Chapter 179. Since when did the Federation have someone like you who doesn't respect his superiors? The director of the 3rd Department of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute held the rank of colonel. He sat on the chair in his office and scolded loudly. He looked at the ordinary-looking assistant researcher in front of him and thought about how he was stopped by this person at the entrance of the laboratory yesterday. His heart was filled with anger because his authority was being challenged. From today onwards, you are transferred to the logistics department. The director looked at Su Lu with contempt. The way he used his authority to toy with his subordinates made him feel much better. He threw the documents in his hand at Lu Zhou and scolded, "You'll see how I'm going to play you in the next few years." Su Lu picked up the personnel transfer documents from his feet and opened the folder. He found that he had been transferred out of the laboratory area and his next office was not far from the parking lot. From a researcher to a handyman, there was no doubt that this was a humiliation and a heavy blow. However, his expression was very calm. This calmness made the director feel that something was wrong. Last night, Zhou had already helped him analyze the situation. Although he had the agreement between old Professor Shin and the Nutshell Mobility Company in his hands, and could prevent those people from entering old Professor Shin's laboratory, his people were still under the jurisdiction of the Nutshell Research Institute and the Department of National Defense. With just a personnel transfer order, those people could drive him to the edge of the area, deprive him of his authority, and make him unable to approach the laboratory again. If he couldn't get close to the laboratory, then he naturally couldn't stop those people from entering the laboratory. Su Lu silently closed the folder. He didn't look at the director. He casually saluted him and walked out of the office. Walking in the quiet corridor, the doors of the laboratories opened one after another. The researchers who usually didn't care about the outside world and only knew how to do research all stood at the door. They looked at Su Lu with a complicated expression as they watched him leave. They didn't know the inside story. They only knew that old Professor Shin's last assistant had offended the company's top management and had been sent away at this time. He was also a researcher. A feeling of sympathy for the death of a rabbit pervaded the entire corridor. Su Lu did not pay attention to the sympathetic gazes of these people. He lowered his head slightly and walked towards the end of the long corridor. Even when he passed by the door of his laboratory, he did not stop at all. A few fully armed military police had already taken control of the entrance of the laboratory. If he wanted to rush in now, what awaited him would most likely be bullets. The people at the Federal Academy of Science obviously needed Professor Shin's research results. However, if those people didn't want to attract attention, they would definitely wait until a few days after he left the laboratory. After the whole thing had died down, they would find a way to enter the laboratory. In other words, Su Lu still had some time, but the time was too short, and he had not thought of how to steal the huge database in the laboratory. The security checks at the Research Institute were extremely strict. Every researcher who entered and left had to go through 3 scans. The Federation's current high-end storage devices might be able to transfer the data from the Research Institute's database, but they definitely wouldn't be able to pass the scans. The next day was Professor Shin's funeral. The location of the funeral was chosen at the Milky Way Public Cemetery on the outskirts of the capital. When black cars in 2s and 3s slowly drove along the mountain road to the cemetery, the late spring sky suddenly started to rain. The raindrops pattered, moistening this world that was filled with a peaceful atmosphere. Su Lu held a black umbrella and silently stood behind Professor Shin, blocking the cold rain from the sky for him. His eyes calmly scanned the crowd beside the grave. Although Professor Shin had long been away from the academic center of the Federation, he was still a Nebula Award winner. He had a very high reputation in the academic circle. Now that he had passed away, whether or not they had forgotten his existence, many people still chose to send him on his last journey. The people attending the funeral wore dark clothes, most of them black, with a small white flower pinned to their chests. Under the cold rain in late spring, and against the cold mountain behind the cemetery, it revealed a sad and solemn feeling. Su Li's right hand firmly held the handle of the umbrella, not letting a single drop of rain fall on Professor Shin's shoulder. This old professor was sad about the death of his father, and he had to deal with so many things. He was mentally exhausted to the extreme. The heavy black coffin was slowly lowered into the deep grave. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the coffin. His gaze seemed to penetrate the thick coffin lid and saw the respected old professor, whose face was full of age spots. In the end, he had accompanied him to smoke a cigarette. At this moment, Suli's heart was even more peaceful and calm. Although until now, he still did not know how to protect Professor Shin's wisdom and prevent it from being stolen by those shameless academic authorities after his death, he knew that he had to do it. Otherwise, he would not be able to face the old man in the grave and himself beside the grave. When Professor Shin knew that Sulu was revising the design of the electron jet and had made great progress, he had warned him of the risks involved. However, the old professor himself probably did not expect that he would die faster than the doctor had expected. He was actually unable to protect Sulu until the successful creation of the new generation of mecha. Sulu retracted his gaze and scanned the people around the grave with a slightly scrutinizing gaze. Some of them were sincere, while others were pretending to be sad. Professor Shin, who was under his umbrella, would not pay attention to this, but he had to. The three major military academies had all sent representatives, especially the dean of the first military academy. However, the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company had only sent an honorary director. What made Sulu feel even colder was that for Professor Shin's funeral, the Federal Academy of Science had actually only sent an office director as a representative. That bald fatty was obviously just a small figure and did not show any respect at all. It seemed that the rumors that Zhou had said were true. Professor Shin had left the Federal Academy of Science in anger a few decades ago, and the relationship between the two had always been extremely cold. All of this might be related to the unwarranted plagiarism incident. The director who had assigned Sulu to the logistics department was exceptionally active today. There were many important people from the three major military academies. He acted as if he had done countless things for Professor Shin in these past few years. There was still no dirt. The director glanced at the foot of the mountain from time to time, as if he was waiting for someone to arrive. Suli's eyes narrowed. He saw 3 black cars earlier than the rest of the people in the cemetery. They were driving along the mountain road towards the cemetery. He did not know who was sitting in the cars. The black cars stopped at the entrance of the cemetery. As if to show respect, they did not drive directly towards the cemetery. A few people who looked like government officials surrounded 2 middle-aged men in the middle. They walked towards the cemetery. The crowd around the cemetery was slightly disturbed and then moved aside to make a path for them. The identities of these 2 middle-aged men were worth the weight of everyone present. After the president's scientific advisor shook hands with Professor Shin, he stood beside the cemetery and read the president's handwritten letter to everyone with a heavy and nostalgic expression. He praised Professor Shin highly for his important role in the development of mecha for the Federation many years ago. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at everyone's expressions in the drizzle. He knew that the so-called funeral was just another form of communication, but when he thought of the old professor's body in the cemetery, he always hoped that this kind of communication would end quickly. The president's scientific advisor was naturally the most respected person present, but Sulu did not pay attention to him. He only used the corner of his eyes to size up the high-ranking officer beside the scientific advisor. The high-ranking officer who was not wearing his military uniform today. That person was about 50 years old. His hair was white, his face was heavy and determined, and his eyes were calm and powerful. Although he was wearing civilian clothes, he still gave off the unique aura of a soldier. Deputy Minister of National Defense Zhou Xing. He was born a technocrat and had been promoted since the General Equipment Base. He had been promoted 2 ranks consecutively from the Deputy Director of the Logistics Department to the Deputy Minister of National Defense. According to internal news in the capital, if Senator Pabre successfully became the president, this person would undoubtedly be the only candidate for the position of Minister of National Defense. Deputy Minister Zhou had been dealing with the equipment of the federal military all his life. Naturally, he had a close relationship with the academic community represented by the 3 military academies and the Nutshell Mobility Company. Today was the day of Professor Shin's funeral. The federal military would certainly send a representative with great influence. It was only natural that he would show up. Sulu glanced at Deputy Minister Zhou from the corner of his eyes. He remembered that when the deputy minister shook hands with Professor Shin, He had also looked at him from the corner of his eyes. His mood became a little strange. The other party must have already known who he was, and the child in Zhou Yu's womb. He had speculated many times that he would meet Zhou Yu's father, but he never would have thought that it would be at a funeral. After reading Mr. President's handwritten letter, the scientific advisor whispered a few words with Professor Shun and expressed his personal sympathy. Only then did he take off the white flower on his chest and gently put it into the grave. When there was a beginning, there was an end. The people who attended the funeral threw the white flower on their chest into the grave. There seemed to be a layer of white snow floating on top of the black coffin. The scientific advisor left first. The funeral gradually came to an end. Deputy Minister Zhou, who represented the federal military, did not leave. He and the dean of the 1st Military Academy were whispering something somewhere in the cemetery. Sulu held an umbrella and accompanied Professor Shun to return the greetings to the people. Suddenly, he tightened his grip on the umbrella and slowly turned his head. He saw that somewhere in the cemetery, there was only Deputy Minister Zhou under a tree. The other party was looking at him coldly. There was a hint of scrutiny in his cold eyes. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He did not impolitely look at this important person. Instead, he lowered his head and whispered a few words in Professor Shun's ear. He handed the umbrella to Professor Shin and then walked under the tree in the drizzle. The director of the research institute, who had just sent the scientific advisor away, was about to seize this rare opportunity to get closer to Deputy Minister Zhou. However, he suddenly saw the young assistant, who he had a very bad impression of, walking toward Deputy Minister Zhou. He could not help but stop for a moment. Endless doubts arose in his heart. Chapter 180. The drizzle continued to fall from the sky above the Milky Way cemetery. Sulu walked towards the big tree in the rain. The Deputy Minister of Defense under the tree coldly watched his every step. When he was about 5 meters away from the tree, 2 officers appeared behind Deputy Minister Zhou and watched him vigilantly. Sulu knew that the Deputy Minister of Defense must be surrounded by the best soldiers of the federal military as a safety barrier, but he didn't stop. Even Mad Manly couldn't beat him. The military, which was considered strong by the citizens of the Federation, couldn't make Sulu feel too much fear. Sulu didn't stop at all. Deputy Minister Zhou's cold eyes showed a hint of complexity. He casually waved his hands behind his back. Although the movement was small, the 2 Federation soldiers immediately retreated to a place far away in silence. Sulu stood in front of the military boss. After a moment of silence, he said, "Hello, I'm Sulu." Deputy Minister Zhou looked at him calmly for a long time before he said softly, "I'm Zhou Xing." There were many factions in the federal military. This was naturally formed through a long history in war. But no matter how you looked at it, Zhou Xing, who had absolute influence in military logistics and was moving from the position of Deputy Minister of Defense to the position of Minister, was undoubtedly one of the most powerful figures in the federal military in recent years. Although he only introduced himself softly, his voice was very clear in the rain. It fully revealed the majesty of this military boss. Sulu lowered his head slightly. From the corner of his eyes, he noticed the hateful director not far away. It seemed that he didn't mean to, but in fact, he was carefully watching them. He couldn't help but have a thought. Zhou is doing very well now. She doesn't smoke or drink. Her child is also quite good. Sulu went straight to the point. Of course, it was impossible for such a big shot to stay in the cemetery temporarily to look at the mountain scenery in the rain with Sulu. Deputy Minister Zhou did not expect the young man to be so direct. He frowned and said after a moment of silence, "Yuzi was hospitalized a few days ago. It was a sign of a threatened abortion, but it's fine now." In an instant, Sulu felt a strong pressure. The other party might have really thought of him as a hairy son-in-law. If Zhou was not feeling well, then it was naturally his problem. Too much pressure, too nervous. Sulu said immediately. There was no need to say it out loud. What he meant was that the Zhou family was giving her too much pressure. Since she used her own life to bet that child's life, she should know that this pressure was not given to her by her family, but by herself. Deputy Minister Zhou's cold face did not soften at all. He looked at Suli's ordinary face and frowned slightly. The drizzle continued to fall. Although it was not heavy, it was enough to wet the clothes of everyone in the cemetery. Some people had already noticed that Deputy Minister Zoe was talking to a young man under the tree. However, they did not know the specific content of the conversation, so they all got into their cars and left. Professor Shin still had to deal with some other affairs. In the empty and quiet cemetery, there were only a few soldiers scattered around, as well as Deputy Minister Zoe and Su Lu under the tree. Of course, there was also the director of the Husk Institute, who pretended to be hiding from the rain, but could not find a suitable place to hide. The rain fell on the brim of Su Li's military cap, making a slight sound. The rainwater flowed down the brim of his cap and onto his face. He could not help but squint his eyes. Deputy Minister Zoe, who was standing in front of him, still had his hands behind his back. He did not care about the rain falling from the sky at all. Today, Su Lu was wearing a military uniform, while Deputy Minister Zoe was wearing civilian clothes. However, in this strange silence, the two of them gave off the opposite feeling. Deputy Minister Zoe was still the real soldier. After a long silence, Deputy Minister Zoe suddenly said coldly, "You knocked up my daughter, and you still dare to stand in front of me without the slightest trace of shame on your face. There are only three possibilities. First, you are an extremely stupid guy who does not know how to spell the word death. Second, you are very confident in yourself and shamelessly trying to use this to gain some benefits. However, this is even more stupid." Su Lu stood upright in the rain and calmly looked at the cold face of Zhou Yu's father. However, he gradually began to feel nervous. The person chosen by Tai Ziyuan should not be this stupid. Deputy Minister Zhou looked at him coldly and said, "You dare to stand in front of me like this, so it can only be the third possibility." Su Lu didn't know how to respond. He could only stand silently in the rain, under the tree, and honestly stand in front of this big boss of the military. Deputy Minister Zhou suddenly sighed. He narrowed his eyes in the rain and half turned his body to look at the misty fog at the foot of the mountain. He slowly said, "After all, you did not discipline your own daughter well. I don't care who you are taking the blame for, but since it is not Tai Ziyuan, and you took the initiative to take the blame, then you can continue to be the scapegoat." When Su Lu heard the first part of the sentence, he was touched. He thought about how arrogant and cold the Zhou siblings were when he met them in Linhai. As a father, he was indeed a failure in disciplining his children. However, when he heard the second part of the sentence, Su Li's body suddenly tensed up. He suddenly raised his head and stared blankly at Deputy Minister Zhou's face, which had suddenly aged a lot. He did not know what to say. This military boss had actually guessed the truth of the matter so easily. Su Lu looked at him in shock. His hands, which were exposed outside his military uniform, clenched slightly. It was not to be cautious, but to hide the shock in his heart. At this moment, Su Lu finally understood why the most mysterious Tai family of the 7 major families in the Federation had decided a long time ago to fully support the general in front of him. This was definitely not because of the relationship between Tai Ziyuan and Zhou Yu when they were young. Instead, it was because the military boss in front of him had enough ability and intelligence to win the respect and help of the Tai family's wife. Thinking about that Major Zhou and Zhou Yu, who was now living a pig-like life in the Wangdu apartment, Su Lu couldn't help but feel a little absent-minded. This father was indeed much more powerful than his children. Since you've chosen to take the blame, then continue to do so. Although it's a bit heavy, I'm sure it'll bring you some benefits. Deputy Minister Zhou didn't look at Su Lu. Instead, he stared coldly at the foot of the mountain and prepared to leave. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and quickly digested the previous conversation in his mind. Suddenly, he raised his head and walked forward with a smile. He gently hugged Deputy Minister Zhou's body as if he was an elder. They hugged intimately and politely, then instantly separated. When Deputy Minister Zhou saw that this young man was hugging him, a strange look flashed across his calm eyes. However, immediately after, a strange smile appeared on his face. Not only did he not stop the young man, but he also raised his hand and gently patted Su Li's back. Deputy Minister Zhou and Su Lu separated. The smiles on their faces disappeared, and they looked at each other calmly. There was a hint of anger in the deputy minister's eyes because he had been used. However, Sulu knew that the other party's anger was not very strong, so he was not afraid. He calmly looked into Deputy Minister Zhou's eyes. He thought to himself, since I am going to take the blame for the Zhou family, why don't you take the blame for me too? Yuzi and I will go home to see you in a few days. In the drizzle of the Milky Way public cemetery, the words that Sulu said to Deputy Minister Zhou were particularly clear. The shameless director of the Husk Institute's third department was sitting in a chair in a daze. Yesterday, at Professor Shin's funeral, he made a very shocking discovery. The young assistant researcher who dared to disobey orders from his superiors and not allow him to enter the laboratory and was sent to the logistics department by him, seemed to have a very close relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou. As an administrative official, this director did not have any achievements in the field of technology that were worth praising. The reason why he was able to continuously rise within the Shell Motor Company was because of his interpersonal relationships. Although the director of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute only had to answer to the board of directors, who was Zhou Xing, he was the most likely person to take over the position of the Ministry of National Defense after the election. If he offended Zhou Xing, he would only have a very miserable ending in the future. When the director thought about the previous phone call to inquire about the news, his face turned extremely pale. That ordinary second lieutenant actually made Deputy Minister Zhou's daughter pregnant. Looking at the scene yesterday, Deputy Minister Zhou did not seem to be very angry with this young man who brought shame to his family. Speaking of which, his daughter was pregnant. What other choice did he have other than marriage? How did that young man named Sulu get so lucky? The director quickly thought in his mind. If Sulu married the daughter of the Zhou family, then he would be the son-in-law of the deputy minister. Next year, he would be the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense. 2 days ago, he pointed at the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense and scolded him. Yesterday, he even chased him away to do cleaning work. When the director thought about this, other than cursing Sulu in his heart, he also felt an unprecedented sense of crisis. At this moment, there was a knock on the office door. The expression on the director's face suddenly became calm. He looked at Sulu, who pushed the door open and walked in. He put on a smile that he thought was very appropriate and said gently, "Second Lieutenant Su, I know that yesterday's personnel transfer may have caused some misunderstanding. I didn't want to explain anything, but I'm worried that if this continues, there may be some problems." He sighed and said seriously, "The decision to seal Old Shin's laboratory was made by the Academy of Sciences and the Board of Directors. I transferred you away because I don't want you to have any conflicts with them. This is to protect you." Chapter 181. Hearing Su Li's request, the director was taken aback. He did not respond immediately, but instead smiled and said, "Second Lieutenant Su, there are many other research departments in the Research Institute's 3 divisions. Which one are you more interested in?" Sulu didn't answer him. She just lowered her head and remained silent. The atmosphere in the office instantly became somewhat tense. The director used a handkerchief to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead and said with some difficulty, "This matter is really a little difficult to handle." Although he did not know the inside story, yesterday morning, the technical supervisor of the company had directly requested that Professor Shin's laboratory be sealed. Moreover, there was also the shadow of those big shots from the Federal Academy of Science behind the scenes. He was just an administrative officer, so of course he did not dare to offend the other party. The problem was, the young second lieutenant standing silently in front of him right now did not seem like someone he could offend either. Right then, Sulu repeated, "I'm just going in to take some personal things." The director wiped away the increasing amount of cold sweat on his forehead, his mind turning quickly. He did not want to offend either side, and even more so, did not dare to offend them. If this son-in-law of the Deputy Minister of Defense only wanted to enter the laboratory to finish up some loose ends, the other side would not be too displeased. The Husk Institute's data security measures were excellent. If this person was allowed to enter the laboratory, he would not be able to cause damage to the database and everything in the laboratory without alerting the security department. Thinking of this, the director made up his mind. He raised his head and said seriously, "The board of directors is currently processing the written order. Tomorrow morning. Second Lieutenant Su, if you move quickly, there should be no problem." Sulu nodded and left the office. Although until now, he still had not thought of a way to steal Professor Shun's research results in the repair design of the MX prototype mecha. At least he would be able to enter the laboratory tomorrow. When the time came, he would take one step at a time. If it really did not work out, he would have to use physical methods to destroy all the storage devices. However, if he did that, it would be a pity and a disservice to Professor Shun. In a high-rise building on 7th Avenue in the Special Capital Region, the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank's headquarters was a dome made entirely of high-strength glass. It greedily absorbed the light and heat of the sun, allowing the green plants on the top floor to grow happily. In the spacious top floor of the building, there was only a desk made of black sea wood. Behind the desk was a chair, and in front of the desk was a sofa. It seemed particularly lonely, but the person behind the table was very used to this kind of loneliness. His family had stood at the top of the Federation's financial world for countless years. This kind of loneliness was actually a kind of glory. At the age of 27, he was already the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank and the heir to one of the 7 major families in the Federation. He was used to standing on the top floor of the tall building in the capital's special district, watching the joys and sorrows of the common people below his feet through the glass. But today, he wasn't looking at the scenery. Instead, he looked at the intelligence files on the table seriously. After a long time, he looked up and said calmly, "We must get the data in the 3rd laboratory of the Research Institute. This is Secretary Luo's request." Although the Academy of Science can pressure the Nutshell Board directly, the assistant researcher seems to be a little troublesome. Opposite the desk stood a blond young man in a military uniform. He was Park Ji-ho, an intern at the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department. This proud and outstanding young man slightly lowered his head, carefully listening to the instructions of the person behind the table. He didn't dare to look up at the other party. He could get along with the 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaodong, like friends, but the real heir of the Li family behind the table was as dazzling as the sun. Park Ji-ho even suspected that if he dared to look at the other party, his eyes would be blinded. How could there be such a beautiful man in the Federation? How could he be so dazzling? Li Xiaozhu was the most beautiful man in the Federation. His eyebrows were as clear and bright as bamboo leaves in a painting. The windshield outside the Sanlin United Bank building was blocked by a glass wall, but that pair of bamboo-like eyebrows seemed to be gently swaying in the wind. He smiled and looked at the cautious Park Ji-ho in front of him and said, "If you handle this matter well, I will recommend you directly to the Federal Academy of Science. Maybe you can become Dean Lin's student." The expression on Park Ji-ho's face finally changed. He gently clenched his fists that were hanging by his side. When he entered the Nutshell Mobility Company from the military academy, he had always thought that he was outstanding. However, he did not expect that he would always be suppressed by Zhou Yu from the first academy. Then, during the spring recruitment exam, there was the poacher named Sulu, directly enter the Federal Academy of Science and become the dean student. This was as wonderful as a dream. The laboratory has been sealed. The written order from the board of directors will be sent the day after tomorrow. I don't understand why you still want to deal with the 2nd lieutenant at this time. Park Ji-ho didn't lose all rational judgment because of this wonderful dream. Li Xiaozhu raised his head, looked at him with a trace of appreciation, and said, "You don't need to understand how I do things. You just need to do it." He didn't explain, but it seemed that the young master of the Li family wasn't unhappy. Park Ji-ho secretly sighed in relief. At this time, Li Xiaozhu lowered his head again and seriously looked at the documents on the desk. He suddenly said, "Since he is the future son-in-law of Minister Zhou, be careful. Don't kill anyone. After the Lin High Stadium incident, the Tai family is going crazy. I don't want that old lady to go crazy." Park Ji-ho was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, "In the Linyuan restaurant, that person didn't lose to Mad Manly." The meaning of this sentence was very clear. If he didn't use firepower, Park Ji-ho had no confidence that he could take care of that young 2nd lieutenant. Li Xiaozhu didn't explain his thoughts. He just waved his hand. The sunlight seeped in through the glass walls in all directions. The multi-layer glass structure could adjust the angle of the light that entered the building space. The light that entered the building space was not dazzling, nor was it burning. It was just warm and clear. In the empty office, Li Xiuzhu was silent for a long time. Then, he walked to the side of the glass wall and looked at the buildings of different heights in the capital special district. He was silent for a long time. Ever since the young master of the Tai family left Lin Hai, there was no trace of him. It seemed that after the assassination, the Tai family had become more vigilant and careful. Li Xiuzhu didn't really care about the young master who wasn't even 20 years old. Although the elders of the family had always maintained vigilance and even respect for the Tai family, he always felt that this kind of family that valued tradition too much was slowly losing its vitality. The Tai family had only one son for 7 generations. This was an advantage, but also a fatal weakness. Li Xiuzhu squinted his eyes and looked at the shadow under his feet on the streets of the capital special district. He couldn't help but feel a little envious. At least that brat Tai Ziyuan didn't have to worry about the distribution of power in the family. However, if this brat died, the Tai family would be finished. Among the 7 families in the Federation, other than the Tai family and the Zhong family, the other 5 families had always faced the problem of the distribution of power. Although these families had a mature inheritance system in the past tens of thousands of years, the conflicts between brothers and sisters wouldn't disappear just because of the existence of the system. Li Xiuzhu chose Park Jiho to do this. On one hand, he wanted to remove himself from this situation. On the other hand, he wanted to consider what kind of reaction the 7th son, Li Xiutong, would have when he found out that he used his own people. Everyone has their own fatal weakness. Li Xiuzhu looked at the scenery outside the window. He looked at the reflection of his beautiful face on the window and frowned. In his opinion, the fatal weakness of the Tai family was that Tai Ziyuan alone had to take responsibility for the continuation of the entire family. The fatal weakness of the old director of the Federal Academy of Science was that his reputation was too good. As for the Sulu that he had ordered to be dealt with, that was his name, right? Li Xiuzhu didn't consider this person. Although this person seemed to have some ability and was gradually emerging, he was still not worthy of his attention. The son-in-law of the Zhou family? Mad Manly didn't defeat him? Professor Shin's student? Li Xiuzhu's eyes showed a trace of coldness. He believed that he was very clear about how terrifying that crazy brat Lee's of Philadelphia was. How could there be anyone in the Federation who could be Mad Manly's opponent? All of this was just a smokescreen. That old man Lee's of Philadelphia had always had a good relationship with Lady Tai. Who knew if Mad Manly's actions at Linyuan that day were to create momentum for that chess piece called Su Le? If it was any other time, before he completely understood Su Li's true background, Li Xiuzhu definitely wouldn't have acted rashly. However, the current situation was different. He had to get the data in the Husk Institute's laboratory. Especially after he found out that Su Lu and Minister Zhou had a conversation at the Milky Way Public Cemetery yesterday, his actions had to be faster. He even didn't mind using more violent methods. He didn't want to drag this matter out until Lin Banshan returned from the Great Triangle. Lin Banshan was the person he feared the most in the Federation. The birth of a new generation of mecha in the Federation was a great reputation. There were great benefits involved. A chess piece like Su Lu should have the awareness to sacrifice himself for the greater benefits. Father, the matter has been dealt with. Don't worry. The latest by the day after tomorrow, the data will be transferred to the hands of the Academy of Science. We still need you to put in some more pressure on the nutshell board. After putting down the phone, Li Xiuzhu informed the secretary downstairs. After a moment of silence, he said, "Don't prepare flowers today. Prepare some delicious and normal food boxes. I'm going to Department 23 to pick someone up." In a manor in the southern hemisphere of Planet S1 in the Upper Forest District, an old man put down the phone in his hand. He turned his head and smiled at the 2 guests beside him. Dean Lin will probably return from the moon base the day after tomorrow. The governor of Jingzhou, Ross, smiled and said, "We will remember Mr. Li's support for us. You're too kind." The current head of the Li family raised the wine glass in his hand and turned to the other guest. He said softly, "Mr. Medellin, I admire your genius thinking. You're probably the only one who can capture Dean Lin's heart." Senator Medellin remained silent. The head of the Li family held his wine glass and narrowed his eyes slightly. He was extremely impressed by the political wisdom of this old fox. If at this critical moment in the presidential election, the Federal Academy of Science, which had always been apolitical but held an extremely high position in the hearts of the Federation voters, suddenly expressed opinions that leaned towards their side under the leadership of Dean Lin and even directly joined their electoral camp. What kind of heavy and powerful blow would that be? Chapter 182. To have enough power to pressure the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company and directly seal Professor Shin's laboratory was not something an ordinary person could do. That night, Zhou had directly called out the name of the director of the Federal Academy of Science. That was a guess based on intuition, and a woman's intuition, especially a pregnant woman's, had a very frightening accuracy rate. Sulu could imagine why the Federal Academy of Science was so determined to snatch the work of the Federation's new generation of mecha. However, at this time, he did not know that behind the scenes, there was also the participation of the 7 major families of the Federation. He also did not know that on a deeper level, the development of the Federation's new generation of mecha was closely linked to the presidential election of the Federation, and all of this had been coordinated and designed by that Senator Macklin. He did not even know that at this time, there were people in the Capital Special District who were preparing to use violent means to deal with him. Danger was approaching him. All of this was to prevent him from interfering with the other party's acquisition of the data in the laboratory. The black car drove smoothly on the wide road of Wangdu. Occasionally, overly green and succulent green leaves would fall gently onto the top of the car and then be abruptly bounced off. These green leaves had not reached the end of their lives. Instead, because they were too young and too nourished, they were envied by the heavens. The night was dark. At the entrance of Mountain Tiger Road, Su Li's eyes narrowed. From the car's radar, he sensed a few cars approaching at high speed from behind. "Fasten your seatbelt," he spoke softly to Zhou beside him. Today was the day of the routine pregnancy checkup, and they had just left Wangdu Hospital. The rapidly approaching cars behind them might be passing racers or trouble, but Su Li's first concern was Zhou's health. On top of the Mountain Tiger Road, an inconspicuous off-road vehicle was quietly parked at the edge of the cliff. The window was rolled down, and the blonde Park Ji-ho coldly looked at the black car on the road below the mountain, as well as the vehicles behind it that were quickly approaching with dazzling headlights. He had used his own channels to investigate Su Lu. He knew that this person was indeed a guy with no background and only had some luck. Therefore, he increasingly felt that this world was very unfair. In the past few years, he had always been vaguely suppressed by Zhou. He could accept this because Zhou was an ace student of the First Military Academy. However, this person called Su Lu, who was he? Why was he able to enter the research institute? Why was he able to impregnate the daughter of the Deputy Minister of National Defense? Why was he so lucky to be able to get acquainted with the young master of the Tai family? Park Ji-ho was a friend of the Li family's 7th young master, Li Xiaodong. Tonight, he was working for the Li family's eldest young master, Li Xiuzhu. He was a smart person. He knew why the Li family's eldest young master, who was as beautiful as a monster, chose him. Therefore, he was very careful in his work. Tonight, they didn't want Su Lu to die. They just wanted him to lie in bed for half a year so that he wouldn't disturb the plans of those big shots. This mission wasn't difficult to complete. The difficult part was that Park Ji-ho didn't want to expose himself to those people. Although he didn't know how powerful Su Li's background was, he still didn't want to face the anger of those people who had nothing to do with him. In fact, this matter didn't require him to do anything. He only found out about Su Li's schedule tonight. Then, through some channels, he told those arrogant and vengeful rich second generations in the capital. Park Ji-ho still remembered how Su Lu humiliated those rich second generations at the entrance of Green Mountain Park that night. With this kind of opportunity, those rich second generations would definitely not let it go. He only needed to calmly watch this scene unfold on the cliff and make sure that Su Lu wouldn't die. He would only be disabled. If anything unexpected happened, he could immediately remedy it, sensing that there was danger approaching from behind. Su Li's expression didn't change at all. After Zhou fastened her seatbelt, she frowned slightly and looked at him. She didn't understand why he was so calm. The black car didn't speed up. Instead, it slowly slowed down and finally stopped at the entrance of Hushan Road. Su Lu carefully looked at the display of the light dots on the car control computer screen. He looked up, as if he wanted to see something on the mountain through the roof of the car. Accompanied by the ear-piercing sound of the brakes and a slightly burnt smell, 5 or 6 high-class sports cars suddenly stopped and surrounded the black car. The people in the car obviously didn't expect that Sulu didn't step on the accelerator and leave. Instead, he stopped, as if he was waiting for them. Sulu opened the door, walked out, and locked all the doors of the black car. Zoe looked at those young people coming out of the expensive sports cars. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her heart. She knew very well that those people were here for revenge. Not only could she tell from their expressions, but also because they all brought their own bodyguards today. In the world of the Federation, money meant everything. No matter what the background of these rich second generations was, their bodyguards were all very powerful people. Looks like I'm lucky today to actually catch you. A young man with a gloomy face and an iron golf club in his hand walked towards Sulu. He stopped about 5 or 6 meters away and said in a cold tone as if he was looking at a dead person, "Don't worry, we know what we're doing. At most, we'll break one of your legs." More than a dozen people surrounded Sulu. Obviously, the valiant men walking at the front were all bodyguards. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the crowd around him. He could feel the abilities of those bodyguards. At the same time, a trace of doubt appeared in his heart. These people obviously didn't bump into him. They came prepared. The problem was that he didn't have any deep hatred with them. Who would deliberately target him? Suli's silence seemed a little strange in the eyes of these people. The young leader said with a sullen face, "Don't talk nonsense. Cut his 2 hamstrings. Let's see how he can step on the gas pedal in the future." Sulu had already forgotten what these people looked like, but when he heard this, he remembered that this young man was the owner of the white sports car that he had knocked into the flood ditch that night. A bodyguard slowly pulled out a knife from his waist. The knife was as cold as water in the night, but there was a faint smell of blood. It seemed that he often saw blood. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He knew that he was unarmed. In the eyes of these people, he was like a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. He had never figured out the identity of these young masters, nor did he want to figure it out. However, looking at the people the other party had brought today, they were indeed professionals. Especially that saber, 7 sabers. The cold gleam on them did not flash at all, but it made his heart somewhat cold. The Federation strictly controlled firearms. Except for people with deep military backgrounds like the Zhou family siblings, no one dared to casually take out a submachine gun to shoot. Even the Zhou family siblings had to be more careful in a place like the Capital Special District. Whether it was in the underworld or in the court, there was always a need for a good weapon to kill people. And there was no doubt that the 7 knives Sulu was facing were used to cutting people's hamstrings and other cruel things. No one was an immortal. Mad Manly was known to be invincible in the army, but that was only in a one-on-one situation. If Mad Manly was facing dozens of shining and cold knives, he would probably immediately turn around and run away. But with that person's fierce reputation, probably no one would dare to chase him. Sulu was only facing 7 knives, and he didn't have enough fierce reputation to intimidate the enemy, so he didn't run away. He already felt that some people and some forces had already targeted him. At this time, there was no point in running away. Whoosh! A knife chopped down at Suli's face. There was no fancy move, only ruthlessness and proficiency that had been immersed in for many years. At the same time the knife flashed, Sulu had already moved. He knew that tonight was dangerous, so he didn't hold back. The bottom of his military boots on the concrete road was like an emergency brake, and the strong friction with the ground provided a strong support for his speed. With a crisp crack, before the knife chopped down, Sulu had already closed in on the bodyguard's arms. He punched the man's armpit, and his right forearm, which was like an iron rod in front of him, actually hit the man's throat. That crisp sound was the sound of the throat cartilage breaking. The bodyguard didn't even make a sound. His body seemed to have been pulled out of his bones, and he softly fell to the ground. The cold knife in his hand had already left his hand and fell to the ground. The faces of the surrounding young masters instantly turned pale. They didn't know that the kid they were going to deal with today was so difficult to deal with. The knife was still falling in the air. Sulu tightly held the handle of the knife. His feet were still firmly planted on the concrete road, and there wasn't a trace of trembling. Only when his feet were firmly planted on the ground could he use the 10 moves he had learned from Uncle Fengyu to show the slyness and ruthlessness of his strength. Sulu believed in his fist, but the knife was always harder than his fist. So he tightly gripped the handle of the knife, lowered his head, and rushed into the snowy light formed by the remaining 6 knives. Rip! The blade cut through his clothes, cut through his flesh, and blood spurted out. Su Li's feet firmly planted on the ground, but his upper body was like a willow branch in the wind, randomly swaying and swaying. He displayed the close combat techniques that had been deeply ingrained in his mind to the extreme. In the light of the knives, he narrowly dodged and rushed forward. He had a pair of eyes that were good at capturing all traces. In his body, he had the most tyrannical power of the Federation. He had the most ruthless techniques. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. The blade light shattered the night sky. It was only a matter of a moment, and the sound of the cold blade cutting through the air suddenly stopped. During this process, the blade that Su Lu was holding tightly did not make a single contact with the 6 blades. The 7 bodyguards who used knives all fell into a pool of blood. Some of them had their throats broken, some had their thighs severely slashed, and even more had a miserable cut on their chest and abdomen. Some of these bodyguards used long battle knives, while others used extremely vicious military knives. At this time, they all fell to the ground in a mess. Sulu held the long knife and silently stood in front of the black car. The cut on his back began to bleed. Chapter 183. There was a mountain on the outskirts of Wangdu, Tiger Mountain. Tiger Mountain Road led up Tiger Mountain. The mountain road was flat but not straight, steep but not dangerous. Because of this mountain, it was often a nighttime entertainment ground for a group of racers. The roar of motors was common, and danger was everywhere. Therefore, the citizens of Wangdu usually hid here. Probably only foreigners like Su Lu, who had just settled down not long ago, would choose to pass through this road. The mountain road extended upward from the entrance, like the chocolate lace on the edge of a cake, circling around. From the very beginning, Park Ji-ho had been standing at the edge of the mountain road on the 2nd level. His gaze passed through the trees on the cliff below and watched the conflict at the entrance. The power behind him had many ways to deal with Su Lu, but the methods on the surface were too slow. They couldn't wait any longer, so they chose the most direct method. But he didn't want Su Lu to die. On the one hand, it was for his own benefit. He could forcefully suppress his jealousy. On the other hand, it was because of the orders of the young master from the Li family. He believed that the young masters who had caught wind of the news would be very careful. After all, under the glory of the first charter, if there was a vicious death in the capital, their parents wouldn't be able to clean up the mess. It would probably be a broken leg and lying in the hospital for a few months. Park Ji-ho rubbed his slightly messy blonde hair and thought about this in the night wind. There wasn't a trace of sympathy on his face, only indifference. That guy called Su Lu lying in the hospital for a few months couldn't affect the plan that he didn't really understand. That slightly messy blonde hair, in the night wind, looked like flowers that bloomed randomly in the mountains in late spring. The car had already turned off, so he believed that the people below wouldn't notice him. In the gentle late spring night wind, Park Ji-ho calmly watched the good show at the bottom of the cliff. He was very gratified by the preparation of those young masters. At this time, he believed in young Master Li's judgment. How could there be a young man in the Federation who was on the same level as Madman Li? However, the moment the blade flashed, the expression on his face suddenly changed. He watched in shock as Su Lu knocked down a bodyguard like a thunderbolt. Park Ji-ho was well aware that although those young masters were good-for-nothings, the bodyguards that their families hired with a large amount of money were the real experts. During their interactions a few days ago, Li Qixiao's sharp eyes had pointed out that these bodyguards should be retired Special Forces soldiers from the military. But why was that bodyguard, who looked ruthless and tyrannical, not a match for Su Lu? Half of Park Ji-ho's heart turned cold. The saber light at the bottom of the cliff rose and fell. Everything returned to normal. Park Ji-ho had a vague feeling that the young second lieutenant had subconsciously raised his head to look at him. That pair of eyes were as cold and sharp as knives. Park Ji-ho shuddered slightly and stopped watching the battle. He turned around and walked towards his car. It would be very dangerous to stay here any longer. The bodyguards of these young masters were all experts. Although they used knives of different sizes and styles, there was a ruthlessness in their bones that showed that they didn't take human life seriously. In the chaotic battle, Su Li's back was slashed by a sinister military knife. The dark blue military uniform was torn apart, and the skin on his back was torn open. His flesh and blood were turned over, and blood began to seep out. Although the injury wasn't serious, it looked particularly terrifying. Until now, his feet had been steadily stepping on the concrete floor and only moved on a flat surface. Like the deep roots of an old tree, he channeled all his strength into his body, making each of his attacks more powerful and accurate than before. With a crisp sound of breaking branches, Su Lu stepped on the wrist of a bodyguard and directly broke his wrist. The bodyguard was cut in the leg and fell into a pool of blood, but he still didn't give up. However, Su Lu didn't give him any chance to sneak attack. At the same time he lifted his leg, the knife in Su Li's hand swung out like a whip, hitting the face of the young master closest to him with unstoppable force. He used the back of the knife, and with one strike, half of the young master's face was cut open. A few teeth and blood spurted out. That arrogant and gloomy face at the beginning was now only filled with fear, pain, and confusion. The confusion was because these young people in the Federation were used to being arrogant. For a moment, they didn't understand how the scene in front of them happened. Why did their bodyguards, who were so good at fighting, fall into a pool of blood one by one? Get lost. In the darkness, at the entrance of Tiger Mountain Road, the young second lieutenant held the saber in his hand. Blood dripped from the edge of the saber. He, who had been silent since he was stopped by the motorcade, finally opened his mouth and said the first word. These young masters were not idiots. The miserable cuts on the bodyguards' bodies had already explained too much. They reacted extremely quickly. Knowing that they had made a big mistake tonight, they did not leave any words to save their faces. They quickly helped the bodyguards on the ground up and returned to their sports cars. The Federation society was like this. The difference in strength was too big, and it was useless to say anything. These young people didn't abandon the bodyguards in the end, which was already considered to be relatively calm. However, their pale faces and slightly trembling bodies exposed their true emotions under Su Li's saber. Su Lu didn't pay attention to these people anymore. Although his back was burning with pain, he knew that these people were just knives used by others. The real character was still hiding behind. No, hiding above. He turned around and raised his head to take a look at the night sky above the cliff. When they stopped earlier, the radar and computer analysis in the black car had already shown on the holographic screen that there was a car above the mountain road. Until now, the car hadn't left. It was very clear that the owner of the car had been watching this scene with cold eyes. Su Lu took off his clothes. The torn clothes on his back rubbed against the flesh and blood. It was very painful. His eyebrows furrowed. However, he found that Zhou Yu in the black car was looking at him in a daze. He threw the military uniform over and blocked the window of the black car. He didn't want a pregnant woman to see the blood on the concrete floor and the remnants of the flesh and blood. While the military uniform was still floating in the air, Su Lu had already rushed toward the cliff. That familiar burning sensation had been circulating in his limbs for a long time. The powerful explosive force made him suddenly move so shockingly fast. He actually brought up a trail of dust on the concrete floor. Zhou Yu turned her head in shock and looked at Su Lu, who was wearing a white singlet. Su Lu was like a ferocious beast. With a whoosh, he passed through the green space beside the road and plunged into the bushes on the cliff of Tiger Mountain. Vaguely, one could see the shrubs on the cliff shake. A shadow shook the soil and rushed up the cliff in a straight line at an extremely fast speed. It was so fast that it was hard to imagine. Zhou Yu put both hands on the window. Her eyes were wide open as she stared at this scene in a daze. She grew up in the courtyard of the 3rd Military Region's General Assembly Base. In this life, she had seen more soldiers than the average Federation citizen on TV. She also knew that the federal military had some terrifyingly capable vanguard soldiers. She had even seen them train with her own eyes. However, she had never imagined that in this world, there would be someone who could see a cliff as flat ground. Like a nimble beast, he would bravely rush up at high speed. After living with Sulu for so long, Zoyu believed that she understood this person very well. She also clearly determined that this young man would definitely make many people in the Federation sit up and take notice of him in the future. However, she never would have thought that the battle strength Sulu displayed tonight would be so powerful. The details of the Linhai State Gymnasium incident had been carefully sealed. Zoyu finally understood why her brother Prince said that Sulu had saved her life when he was in the Donglan district, under the protection of the glory of the Charter. The electronic wall that stretched for who knew how many kilometers was only a slightly more difficult obstacle in Suli's eyes. Not to mention this cliff in front of him that, although the slope was steep, he could still land his feet on it. Sulu landed on the hillside. Every step he took on the stone was exceptionally stable. This was because stability ensured speed and accuracy. Every step he took was very powerful. However, the recoil from every step he took with the cliff made the wound on his back more painful. The more pain he felt, the angrier he became. However, the calmer his heart was, the calmer his expression was. He had fled from the Donglan district to the capital ring. He had left his home and forgotten his past. His girlfriend had turned into a firework. His good friend had fled thousands of miles away, leaving behind a pregnant woman. All of these sad memories and the depression that had accumulated over the past 2 years finally turned into anger and explosive desire under the stimulation of the pain of his wound. He considered himself to be a very peaceful person. However, there were so many unfairness in the Federation that he could not get rid of it like the air around him. Professor Shun was dead. Those high and mighty dazzling big shots wanted to seize what had not belonged to them. Tonight, there were even people who wanted to set up a trap to kill him. Until today, Sulu still thought that he was just a small character in the Federation. However, once a small character was enraged, they were still very scary. There was a proverb in the Federation. Once an ordinary man is angry, even the king will bleed. Today, the most powerful person in the Federation happened to be called an ordinary man. A few sharp thorns from the shrubs pierced into his exposed arms. Suli's expression did not change in the slightest. He stepped onto the road above the cliff and directly rushed toward the off-road vehicle that was about to start the engine. The power in his body burst out in an instant. Every pair of muscle fibers in his legs began to squeeze and twist. A moment later, he rushed to the side of the off-road vehicle. Without saying anything, he stabbed the tip of the knife diagonally downwards. A series of screeching sounds that made one's teeth ache resounded throughout the quiet Tiger Mountain Road amidst the sparks of metal grinding against metal. The long knife in Suli's hand accurately stabbed into the door right before it closed. The door and the knife rubbed against each other and vibrated. In the end, the door did not close and instead bounced open. The silent Sulu did not say anything. He stabbed the tip of the knife into the spot beside the driver's seat of the off-road vehicle. The tip of the knife broke through the high-energy plastic and pierced through the complicated circuits. Accompanied by tiny electric sparks, he successfully destroyed the ignition system of the off-road vehicle. He was a genius mechanic. In the Donglan District's Xianglan Avenue repair shop, he had once repaired cars. Today, he could even deal with mechas, not to mention a simple off-road vehicle. With the ignition circuit destroyed, this off-road vehicle could no longer escape. Sitting in the driver's seat, Park Ji-ho stared blankly at the cold blade that was less than 10 centimeters away from his thigh. His left hand that was holding the steering wheel and his right hand that was holding the key to start the engine began to tremble uncontrollably. Chapter 184. Park Ji-ho didn't want to admit that he was in fear. He had always thought of himself as the best of the younger generation in the Federation. He was an outstanding student from the 3 major military academies. He entered the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department and was about to enter the Federal Academy of Science. He might even become Dean Lin's student. His life experience and achievements were enough to provide him with a strong sense of self-confidence. He was a young officer. Regardless of whether it was close combat or mecha combat, he was an extremely strong character. No matter how one looked at it, although the off-road vehicle couldn't move, he shouldn't be afraid. However, his slightly trembling hands made Park Ji-ho realize that he had developed a natural fear of the person beside him. Previously, when he stood on the cliff and looked down, he saw the snow-like gleam of the blade and the splash of blood. Su Li's strong strength, especially his calmness during the bloody battle, left a deep impression on Park Ji-ho. He even felt danger, which was why he chose to leave immediately. However, the opponent found him in such a short time and used a blade to cut off all his escape routes. Park Ji-ho felt a deep chill, especially when he thought of the rumor that night at the Linyuan restaurant. Even Mad Manly couldn't beat this person. His two hands trembled even more violently. The two moons in the sky were all behind the clouds. Tiger Mountain Road was dark. Only the lights at the bottom of the cliff faintly illuminated the peace of the Wan family. The car door creaked. Park Ji-ho walked out of the off-road vehicle. He lowered his head and looked at the blade tightly held in Su Li's hand. He looked at the blood that was gradually turning into a thick paste on the blade. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. How did you get yourself into such a mess? A smart person would know that in this situation, there was no point in saying such things, especially when Park Ji-ho's face was pale. However, Park Ji-ho still said it because he had to take a gamble. He had to see if this young soldier named Su Lu in front of him had the guts to do it. Who sent you? Su Lu looked at Park Ji-ho's blonde hair and lowered his head slightly. His grip on the hilt of his sword tightened. When he saw Park Ji-ho, he should be able to guess the power behind him. A smart person wouldn't ask too much, but he still did. Park Ji-ho smiled bitterly and said, "It's meaningless to ask these questions. Just now on the road, you didn't even kill those people who wanted to kill you. Naturally, you won't kill me. Since you won't kill me, I won't tell you anything. I just want to remind you that in front of a truly powerful force, you are just a small fry. No matter how good you are at fighting, as long as they say the word, you will be beaten into a hornet's nest." Su Li's expression did not change at all. His head was still slightly lowered. After a while, he said, "I've always wanted to be a law-abiding citizen, but unfortunately, the Federation did not give me this opportunity. When I was in my teens, I had already killed someone." When he said this, his tone was very calm and unhurried. It was as if he was telling Park Ji-ho how to solve the spring recruitment exam questions. However, it was this calm tone that made Park Ji-ho's face, which had just improved a little, turn even paler. "I was wrong." Park Ji-ho smiled bitterly and said, "I was really wrong. I shouldn't have turned off the engine. At least, I shouldn't have pulled out the key." This was a sincere sentence, but it was a fatal mistake. Since he was using someone else to kill, there was no reason for him to appear at the scene. Park Ji-ho's mistake was that he thought he was careful enough hiding on the mountain road. He didn't expect Su Lu to be able to find him in such a short time and cut off his escape route. At this moment, he vaguely understood that the reason he insisted on standing on the cliff of Husan Mountain Road and watching this scene unfold was not to deal with an emergency. It was just that he subconsciously still couldn't forget the scene in the spring recruitment exam in nutshell. He wanted to see Su Lu, this lucky soldier, with his own eyes. He wanted to see with his own eyes Su Lu, this lucky soldier, break his leg and roll on the concrete road in pain. Li Xiuzhu also made a mistake. He thought he had overestimated Su Lu, but he still underestimated him. Of the 7 big families in the Federation, the Li family was known for its meticulous planning. However, in the eyes of the Li family's legitimate successor, Su Lu, a small figure, was not a guy that could be deduced with common sense. Su Lu was an anomaly that broke into the upper circle of the Federation. He was as hard and stubborn as a rock. His strength did not lie in the Tai family, nor did it lie in the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense. It lay in the knowledge in his mind and the strength in his body. The pale-faced Park Ji-ho muttered to himself that he was wrong. However, his slightly lowered eyes became calmer and calmer. He didn't know if Su Lu in front of him would suddenly make a move, but he knew that if he really dared to say anything, What awaited him in the future would still be a dead end. His hands trembled at his sides as if out of fear. However, in reality, he knew that he was only trying to make his hands appear more natural. There was still a few centimeters of distance between him and the pistol at his waist. With his fastest draw speed and shooting results in the military academy, Sulu in front of him, even if he really had the terrifying strength of Mad Manly, only death would await him. Suli's head was also slightly lowered. He didn't notice the hidden changes in Park Ji-ho's eyes. He also didn't notice that Park Ji-ho's expression had gradually calmed down. This was because in the mine in the Donglin district, Uncle Feng Yu had reminded him more than once that in this kind of situation, he only needed to stare at the opponent's hands. Park Ji-ho's trembling hands suddenly moved. He leaned to the side like lightning and pulled out the pistol he always carried with him. Sulu also moved. The long knife in his right hand chopped down, and the light of the knife lit up. This was a good sharp knife. Park Ji-ho's right hand, accompanied by a spurt of blood, separated from his wrist. It fell to the concrete floor together with the pistol that glowed with a metallic luster. This outstanding officer of the new generation of the Federation, with a bright future, quietly looked at his wrist that was as neat as a broken branch. He looked at the gurgling blood on it. He looked at the dazzling white bone and the threads of flesh on his broken wrist. His brows furrowed. Park Ji-ho didn't understand why Suli's knife was so fast. Why did he dare to swing it over so unreasonably? Could it be that from the very beginning, the opponent had already made up his mind to kill him? At this moment, he didn't think that he was the one who wanted to pull out his gun and kill Sulu. It was only at this moment that the clear and maddening pain from his broken wrist transmitted into his brain. It made him feel so much pain that he wanted to die. He wanted to howl in grief. However, he couldn't howl in pain because a thin line of blood appeared on his neck. The blood began to seep down from the line. It looked like a white can of ketchup that had been cut by a knife. Park Ji-ho turned his head painfully and stared at Suli's face in disbelief. Until the moment of his death, he still felt that this matter was ridiculous. How could a person like him, who was destined to be famous in the Federation, die so early? How could he die so quietly on Hushan Road? When he turned his head, the blood in the line on his neck flowed even faster. He used his left hand and his right hand, which only had one wrist left, to cover his throat. However, he couldn't stop his life from flowing away with the blood. He fell to the ground with a thud. He twitched a few times, and then stopped moving. Sulu looked at Park Ji-ho's body on the ground. He felt a little strange. He wasn't a master of swords. The previous chop was just a subconscious reaction under the dangerous situation. The blade was aimed at his wrist. He didn't expect the blade to be slightly deformed when it was clipped by the door of the off-road vehicle. The sharp tip of the blade actually swept past his neck. This wasn't the first time he killed someone. When he killed someone for the first time, he was still very young. That night, it was raining heavily in the garbage dump behind Bell Tower Street. The sharp hydraulic pipe was so light in his hand. In the underground parking lot of Lin High Gymnasium, Sulu had also killed several people, but that was in the middle of a battle after all. Today, he had only met Park Ji-ho a few times, but he had clearly seen him die in front of him. Sulu always thought of himself as a good person. He also wanted to be a good person. However, would a good person kill someone? This was a philosophical question. He didn't want to think about it. He looked at Park Ji-ho's body on the ground. He didn't want to vomit or blame himself. He just felt a little confused. However, the confusion only lasted for 3 seconds. He turned around and walked down the cliff. "Fasten your seatbelt," Sulu whispered to Zoyu in the passenger seat. He had already taken off his blood-stained vest. He found a spare shirt in the trunk and put it on. However, the faint smell of blood was still so pungent in the enclosed space of the car. Zoyu looked at him quietly. Her hands carefully covered her swollen abdomen. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright. She didn't know what Sulu did when he rushed up the cliff. However, looking at Suli's calm expression and the ominous smell of blood, she could vaguely guess. This was a mysterious guy. "I'll take you home." The black car quickly left Hushan Road. It didn't drive to the simple apartment they had lived in for a long time. Instead, It turned around and headed to the Capital Special District at the end of Highway 2. What happened? Zhou lowered her eyes and asked softly. I killed a person. Maybe in a while, I will be wanted by the Federation. Sulu looked at the flashing signs on the highway in front of the car window. After a moment of silence, he said, Park Ji-ho, the person Li Xiaodong took with you when you raced last time, it has something to do with me? After Zhou became pregnant, she became much gentler. In particular, her pair of black eyes always flashed with a sentimental light. However, she was a cold girl who liked to wear red. After hearing that Sulu killed someone, the shock in her eyes disappeared. She calmly cared about the truth behind the matter. No, it should be related to the data in the laboratory. Those people wanted to steal Professor Shen's data, but I was in the middle. Sulu slightly turned the steering wheel in his hand. Following the signs on the highway, he drove in the direction of the Ministry of National Defense's apartment in the Capital Special District. After a moment of silence, he continued, I have to do something tonight, and I think it will be difficult to accompany you to protect the baby in the future, so I have to take you home first. I hope you won't be angry. It was rare to hear Sulu joke about protecting the baby in his sentence. Zhou's expression didn't change at all. She looked at Su Li's side profile with a dignified expression and asked, What do you want to do? Where does Li Xiaodong usually go at night? After hearing this, Zhou's eyebrows instantly furrowed tightly. Her hands nervously covered her abdomen. She sighed and said, My stomach is a little uncomfortable. Accompany me to the hospital first. Chapter 185. The harsh and seductive Zhou, the quiet and peaceful Zhou, the red windbreaker wearing Zhou, the cute maternity dress wearing Zhou, they were all Zhou. After hearing Zhou's somewhat abrupt request, Sulu fell silent. He was not stunned by the silence, but instead, the corners of his mouth drew back, revealing his neat white teeth as he laughed heartily. To a Donglin orphan like Sulu, the Federation was a cold world filled with the smell of money and the smell of metal and machinery. However, it was always good to have someone concerned about his life and death. Zhou had subconsciously said this because she was worried about Sulu. Sulu understood this concern and shook off his previous gloominess. He said very seriously, Thank you. Other than thank you, Sulu did not say anything else in response to the concern of the eldest daughter of the Zhou family. He stared unblinkingly at the road in front of the car that stretched endlessly in the dark night. His calm expression revealed a sense of determination. The silence in the car lasted for a long time. Zhou's eyelids were lowered slightly, her eyelashes resting lightly on her fair skin. She knew that although this fellow beside her looked quiet and optimistic, in reality, there was always a stubbornness in his bones that no one could understand. As long as he had decided on something, there was probably no one in this world who could stop him. The Zhou of the past would definitely not have cared about Su Li's life and death. To the her of that time, Su Lu was a completely insignificant character in another world. However, after dozens of days and nights in the Wangdu apartment, even two stray cats in a junkyard might have developed some feelings of mutual support, let alone two real people. Thus, Zhou decided to help Su Lu analyze some things and see if she could help him. We need to understand why the Li family would think of dealing with you to ensure the flow of the laboratory data. The development of the new generation of mecha is definitely a top priority for the federal military right now, but the Iron Calculator is a financial magnate of the Federation. It is impossible for him to suddenly switch over to the field of technology. Her gaze slowly turned to Qingqiu, who was passing by quickly at the side of the window. She said, In the eyes of those people, you are just a nobody. There is no reason for them to do anything to you. Unless the Li family misjudged my relationship with you and were worried that you would hand over the data from the laboratory to my father, or the Tai family. Seeing that Su Lu didn't answer, Zhou was silent for a moment before she suddenly said, The Li family has always been secretly supporting Jingzhou's Governor Ross and Senator Macklin. It just so happens that they are at odds with the Tai family. I think this matter shouldn't be that simple. Su Lu narrowed his eyes slightly. The smell of blood on his body had been diluted by the automatic air conditioning device in the black car, but at this moment, it seemed to have thickened a little. In the past, our analysis should have been that the Federal Academy of Science wanted to take the credit for the development of the new generation of mecha. Now, there is another Lee family. Zhou didn't sense the change in Su Li's mood. She frowned slightly and said, "In the presidential election, Dean Lin is indeed a variable." If Sulu knew that Zhou analysis of the current situation was so close to the truth, he would definitely be very impressed by this young, unmarried mother's political sense. Since the beginning of puberty, the woman that the madam of the Tai family had nurtured with countless afternoon tea sessions. Under that arrogant and cold face, bits and pieces of wisdom regarding politics would always gather together and become some kind of asset. However, at this moment, Sulu no longer cared about the political strife and schemes of so many of the Federation's upper echelons. He was a small fry, so he had his own way of doing things. So, he only suddenly opened his mouth and asked again, at night, "Where does Li Xiaodong usually stay?" Seeing that Sulu didn't seem to care much about her analysis, a trace of displeasure flashed through Zhou eyes. She said calmly, "If the laboratory data you want to take back is really related to the presidential election, I advise you to let go. The Federal Academy of Science and Li family. This is the perfect combination of knowledge hegemony and the magic of money. And, if it is as I have guessed, and it is related to the presidential election," she looked at him coldly. "You are like a toad blocking the highway. You won't be of any use at all. Besides, what's the point of you looking for Li Xiaodong?" She sighed softly. Speaking from the bottom of her heart, she had long developed feelings of admiration towards Su Li's calm and sincere personality that hid an infinite amount of ruthlessness. However, the Federation only cared about strength. Money, status, power, and even influence in the military were all real strength, but they never included personal martial strength. Unless that person's personal strength was like that of the military god from the Lees of Philadelphia, who was above all rules. No matter how good Sulu was at fighting, at the current stage, he was still countless galaxies away from the high and mighty seven great families and the colossal Federal Academy of Science. Even Lady Tai will remain silent on this matter. First of all, you are not a member of the Tai family. Second of all, this is the Li family's plan. She may be able to sense the enormous benefits involved, but she won't so easily make a decision that will destroy the other party's plan. The seven great families of the Federation have coexisted for tens of thousands of years. They don't rely on annual wars, but rather on mutual compromise and coexistence. In the end, they are people of the same world. Although they may choose different partners in the political world, they won't easily start a war because of these differences. The seven great families of the Federation have at least had a few hundred years of peace. It is not uncommon for them to marry each other. You are Sulu. You are an insignificant person. Your surname is not Zhong, nor is your surname Lin, nor is your surname Si. How can you possibly contend against the Li family? If you are really my man, perhaps this matter can still be turned around. I don't mean that you might be able to steal back the data in the laboratory, but I mean that you won't be dragged into prison because of this matter. Zhou didn't hold anything back anymore. She directly analyzed all the possibilities for him to hear. Sulu listened silently, but his expression didn't change at all. His small eyes narrowed slightly, and he said slowly, "When I first started working in Old Shan's laboratory, I once told myself that I might have met a strange person. I even thought very self-deprecatingly that it couldn't be that this strange person would really take me as his last disciple and pass down all his legacy to me. What I didn't expect was that Professor Shin really did leave that laboratory to me in his will. Leaving aside the use of the data in the laboratory for the Federation's first-generation mecha, to be able to ensure that after Professor Shin's death, the normal citizens of the Federation will forever remember him." Su Li's eyes narrowed even more. He said, "Even if there were only a few pieces of paper in that laboratory, I wouldn't let anyone snatch those pieces of paper away." Zhou was silent. She understood Su Li's meaning. It was just like the famous saying from the distant imperial dynasty tens of thousands of years ago. "The monarch treats me like a country scholar, so I return the favor like a country scholar." This saying was actually not very accurate to describe Su Li's current mood, but there wasn't much of a difference in his emotions. towards the old man's unwarranted trust and great trust. Other than unhesitatingly persevering, there was no other way. The 7 great families of the Federation and those politicians could play politics, compromise, or give in to each other. They would give you some leeway here and seek tacit benefits elsewhere. These were all methods. However, Sulu didn't have the qualifications to play these games, nor did he have such thoughts. He had no way out, so he could only continue forward. The black car stopped at the side gate of the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of Defense. In the shadows, fully armed soldiers were standing guard, but no one cast a glance at the car. Zoyu put down the phone, turned her head, and looked deeply at Sulu. She said, "When an ordinary man is angry, he has to have a reason to be angry and know when to advance and when to retreat. Although Park Ji-ho is one of his people, this matter isn't necessarily his doing." Sulu was enlightened. He lowered his head and said, "Understood. Don't worry." Zoyu sighed. She vaguely saw a figure walking out of the West Mountain compound. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She softly said an address, then looked seriously at Sulu and said, "You have to remember, my due date is still a few months away. Since you promised to take care of me, you have to come back safely." Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. However, in his heart, there was a hint of sadness that he hadn't felt for a long time. If he really had a direct confrontation with the Federal Academy of Science and the Lee family, how could he, who had just killed someone, return to that simple apartment in Wangdu? The black car left the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of Defense and drove towards the address that Zoyu mentioned. He saw from the rear-view screen that Zoyu had already been picked up by a middle-aged woman and Zoyu. He was relieved. Driving between the sometimes quiet and sometimes bustling buildings of the Capital Special District, Sulu thought for a moment, then used the car phone to dial a number. A moment later, he heard Butler Jin's slightly hoarse voice. "Tai Ziyuan said that if I run into any trouble, I can call you." Su Li's right hand held the streamlined microphone. He was a sincere and down-to-earth young man, but that didn't mean he was a pedantic guy. Back at the capital spaceport, Madame Zhong's business card was still in his pocket. This fully showed that, at certain moments, he was willing to lower his head and seek the help of these truly important people. At a critical moment, to blindly brag about one's loftiness and not ask for external help, fighting with one's saber. That was stupidity, not an outstanding quality. However, listening to Butler Jin's slightly bland reply, which was very much like the sound of fruit juice mixed with it, Su Li's expression gradually became serious, and the microphone beside his cheek seemed to become cold. Should he report to Lady Tai tomorrow? Sulu didn't hide anything during the phone conversation. He directly told Butler Jin about Zoyu's speculation and the importance of the laboratory data that he wanted to protect. However, Butler Jin continued to reply calmly. The 7 major families of the Federation were involved in the interests that the iron scheming family wanted. Butler Jin naturally couldn't promise Sulu a single word. This was something that Sulu could think of. However, Butler Jin's tone made him narrow his eyes. "It's too late tomorrow." Although the director of the 3rd Department said that the laboratory would only be sealed the day after tomorrow, Sulu knew that once the news of Park Ji-ho's death spread, it would be very difficult for him to enter the research institute again. Furthermore, the other party would definitely speed up the pace of seizing the laboratory data. If nothing unexpected happened, the technical director of the research institute, who obviously had a background in the Academy of Science, would directly take over Professor Shin's laboratory with the written order of the board of directors tomorrow morning and remove all the data related to quantum measurability. Although this clearly violated the agreement signed between Professor Shin and the research institute back then, and it also conflicted with the copy of Professor Shin's will that Sulu currently had. However, in the face of pressure from the Federal Academy of Science, Sulu simply couldn't find any way to stop all of this. A strong sense of disappointment and helplessness filled Suli's mind. He leaned against the car door and took a deep breath of the 377 brand cigarette. He didn't wake up until the cigarette tip warmed his nails. He looked at the quiet and noble garden building not far from his feet, licked his lips, and pulled out the bright long knife from the car window beside him. The 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaodong, Park Ji-ho's master, should be in this garden building, which was called the Ivy Garden by the citizens of the capital. In the southeast corner of the Ivy Garden, there was a man-made stream that flowed for many years. Decayed soil fell to the bottom of the stream, and old trees stretched their roots out of the embankment. In the spring, flowers and trees were densely planted on the embankment. Two bright round moons peeked out of the clouds and gently shone on the treetops. Behind this beautiful scenery, there was a single building. The appearance of the building was not very eye-catching, but the ancient style of the hooked eaves, although it didn't show the temperament of the owner of the building, at least it showed the owner's economic strength. This was the best and most remote location in the Ivy Garden. The rich people who lived in the front didn't know who this building belonged to. The 7 families of the Federation lived in the Federation, but they were like the shadows of the clouds, not easily showing their true faces. There were flowers under the window, flowers on the window, flowers on the bed curtains, and 2 conspicuous red flowers on the naked woman's jade-like body on the bed. The 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, got up from the woman's body in satisfaction. He lightly patted the woman's plump buttocks, chuckled, and rushed her to take a bath. He put on a dark-colored pajamas and went to the window. He looked at the flowers above and below the window, slightly lost in thought. He was a person who cherished flowers, but there were too many flowers around him, so he naturally became a playboy. It was only a few months ago, when he had some thoughts about the daughter of the Zhou family, that he restrained himself a little. But he didn't expect that the eldest daughter, who was used to using arrogance to cover up her loneliness, was actually pregnant. Li Xiaotong returned to his original playboy life. This afternoon, Li Xiaotong had found a piece of information that made him angry, so he was not in a good mood. Although he was still gentle and decent in front of that woman, once the pleasure was over, he felt a little lonely and sad. He was the 7th young master of the Li family, but in front of that beautiful man, he didn't have any glory. That person didn't even need to fight, and the people he liked would abandon him one after another and throw themselves into the arms of that person, because that person was the true successor of the Li family. The moment he thought of this, the dark and ruthless look in his deep facial features and dark and calm eyes suddenly became a bit thicker. He was originally an extremely outstanding person. Casually standing among the flowers, he was like an untamed plum, disdaining to move no matter how the snow clouds moved in the sky and the snowstorm hit his body. It was also because of this coldness that occasionally leaked out that he was evaluated as having a sinister temperament in his family. Just that he looked a bit sinister, but what did that have to do with his temperament? Li Xiaotong frowned and thought, then laughed self-deprecatingly. Since he was evaluated as having a sinister temperament, then he deliberately acted more sinister these past few years. In any case, he couldn't win against that person, so there was no need to fight. At the age of 16, he was selected as the 2nd successor of the Li family. At that time, Li Xiaotong was so well regarded, but after being suppressed for so many years, he knew that he wasn't that person's opponent, so he simply gave up. With the Li family's inexhaustible wealth, he wandered around the nightclubs of the major planets of the Federation, driving that silver wraith, lonely and lonely. Li Xiaotong silently sat on the sofa by the window, slightly raising his head, looking at the bright moon outside the window and the short flowers and trees on the windowsill. After that woman finished bathing, she would leave and never come back to this room. This was his rule. A gust of night wind blew in, and the thick cyan curtain by the window moved slightly. Li Xiaotong's pupils slightly shrank, and his hands subconsciously reached back, but immediately stopped. The tip of a knife that reflected the white moonlight appeared in the cyan curtain. At this moment, the knife's light was so dazzling. Almost at the same time, the door of the room silently opened, and a man in dark clothes aimed a pistol behind the curtain. The black metal barrel of the gun was so cold at this moment. Seeing that man's arrival, Li Xiaotong's narrowed pupils gradually relaxed, but he still didn't move at all, quietly looking at the tip of the knife. Since the man with the gun didn't shoot directly, it meant that he thought that the person behind the curtain with the knife could hurt him even if he was shot. Li Xiaotong's greatest strength was that he never underestimated anyone, and he trusted the judgment of a professional. So he didn't move at all. After staying on the mountain behind the ivy garden for a long time, Sulu finally found a chance to approach this independent building. With the amazing strength trained by Uncle Fengyu, he wouldn't be afraid even when facing the special elite of the military, but it was so difficult to quietly break through those defenses. He finally understood that the 7 great families of the Federation were not ordinary forces, and even a second-generation figure like Li Xiaotong had such a strong security force around him. While Li Xiaotong was enjoying the pleasure of a man and a woman, Sulu secretly sneaked into the room. At this time, the bodyguard shouldn't be in the room, so this was the best opportunity. However, what shocked Sulu was that before he could do anything, the bodyguard in dark clothes quietly opened the door and pointed a gun at him. A trace of dangerous aura filled the entire room. Sulu slowly walked out from behind the blue curtains. He didn't look at the 7th young master of the Li family who was sitting on the sofa next to him. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the middle-aged bodyguard with a gun at the door. Even if the middle-aged bodyguard didn't have a gun in his hand, he was still an extremely dangerous person. Suli's eyes narrowed even more. Previously, he didn't hear any footsteps outside the door, and he didn't even hear any breathing. How did this person appear? How could he be so powerful? The middle-aged bodyguard in dark clothes was also quietly looking at Sulu. His right shoulder was slightly drooping, and his muscles were extremely relaxed. The special pistol in his hand moved precisely with Suli's every step. As long as he wanted to, he could pull the trigger at any time and kill Sulu. However, he didn't because Suli's left hand was protecting the upper half of his face. This posture looked a bit wretched, and it was obviously impossible to block a bullet with one arm. However, the middle-aged bodyguard's expression gradually became dignified. In fact, apart from the Tai and Zhong families, the 7 families of the Federation didn't really worry about the safety of their descendants. This was because those families had many children. Since it was impossible for the enemy forces to use this method to deal a fatal blow to these families, they naturally didn't want to use this kind of iron-blooded method to attract the endless revenge of these families. Even so, there would still be people responsible for the safety of these second-generation children of the 7 families. This was especially true for second-generation heirs like Li Xiaotong. Whether he was willing or not, there would be an extremely terrifying expert protecting him on his left and right. At this time, the middle-aged bodyguard who forced Sulu into a desperate situation was precisely such a person. This middle-aged bodyguard's face was ordinary, but his body under his clothes was like a gun that could break free at any time and cut through everything in front of him, directly taking the enemy's life. Sulu felt this kind of threat, so he didn't dare to move lightly. In the past few days, the most powerful people Sulu had seen should be that fatty Captain Tian and Mad Manly. A monster like Uncle Fengyu was naturally excluded. However, perhaps because the situation was different, neither Captain Tian nor Madman Li gave Sulu a stronger sense of danger than this middle-aged bodyguard at this time. The Federation was indeed full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Existences like the 7 great families were indeed not something that could be challenged by mere brute courage. Just as Sulu felt a faint sense of regret, he didn't know that Li Xiaotong and the middle-aged bodyguard who had been silent all this time became even more vigilant after seeing his face clearly. A person who could quietly sneak into the bedroom of the 7th young master of the Li family and use only a long knife in his hand to make the middle-aged bodyguard not dare to move lightly was really rare in the Federation. There were rumors that after I left Linyuan that day, you and Mad Manly fought to a draw. I always thought that it was an exaggeration. My big brother thinks that Mad Manly deliberately gave you a chance to become famous because of that Crown Prince and Miss So family. In the tense silence, the 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, suddenly looked at Su Li's face and laughed. He lightly clapped his hands and said, "Only today did I know that the rumors were true." His expression suddenly calmed down, and a trace of sternness flashed through his gloomy eyes. He slowly said, "Even Mad Manly can't quietly approach my bed. I'm really curious, Sulu. How did you do it?" Sulu had his own secrets. In the capital ring, he dared to fight against the forces that had been passed down for thousands of years in the Federation. The skills that Uncle Fengyu had left for him naturally had a channel to use. At this time, he naturally couldn't explain anything to Li Xiaodong. When he heard Li Xiaodong call out the intruder's name, the middle-aged bodyguard's expression became even colder. Since the intruder knew Li Xiaodong and dared to come in without hiding, he naturally had the intention to fight to the death. It wouldn't matter if it was a normal person, but the middle-aged bodyguard clearly knew that the ordinary-looking young man holding a knife behind the curtain was definitely not a normal person. He took a few steps forward. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He noticed that the man's shoulders and arms didn't tremble at all when he took a step forward. The gun muzzle was terrifyingly steady. He couldn't let this person come any closer. When he was within 5 steps, even if he died, he wouldn't be able to threaten Li Xiaodong's life. To Su Li's surprise, Li Xiaodong smiled and said to the middle-aged bodyguard, "Brother Zhang, don't be too nervous. Su Lu is my friend." Su Lu and Li Xiaodong had only met once and a half. Naturally, they weren't friends. He didn't quite understand the deeper meaning of this sentence. "You want to kill me?" Li Xiaodong was still sitting on the sofa, and his gloomy face gradually relaxed. "I'm not a normal person. If you kill me, the Bureau of Proclamation will definitely put you on the wanted list. Whether you can escape or not, your life will be ruined." At this time, Su Lu said the first sentence after entering the room. "I've already killed Park Ji-ho." Hearing this, Li Xiaodong didn't look nervous or angry at all. After being slightly startled, he laughed. His laughter grew louder and louder. It was actually an indescribable joy and satisfaction. The laughter gradually stopped. His cold and gloomy face instantly relaxed. He said calmly, "Good kill." Chapter 186. Li Xiaodong stood up from the sofa and took out a file folder from the drawer beside the bed. During this process, the long knife in Su Li's hand rotated along with his movements. Although Li Xiaodong's previous laughter and words confirmed the situation that Su Lu vaguely expected at this time, the bodyguard called Brother Zhang still coldly pointed the gun at him, so he didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless. "Brother Zhang, I have something to talk to this friend." Li Xiaodong handed the folder in his hand to Su Lu. His attitude was very relaxed and casual, as if he didn't see the bloody long knife in Su Li's hand at all. Brother Zhang was silent for a moment. The peerlessly sharp spear-like aura in his clothes slowly faded away. He nodded slightly at Li Xiaodong and replied with a hoarse and strange trembling voice, "Yes, young master." Su Lu watched the man put down the gun and leave the room. His mind was really relaxed, and he took the folder in Li Xiaodong's hand. The dangerous smell of this bodyguard called Brother Zhang was too strong, sometimes like a gun, sometimes like a lion, which made people's hair stand on end. There were several photos and an audio file in the folder. The photos should have been taken secretly from a distance. The content was in a high-rise building in the capital. The blonde Park Ji-ho was talking to a man. The person who took the photos should be very far away from the building, so the faces of Park Ji-ho and the man in the photos were very vague. But even so, he could vaguely feel the extraordinary momentum of the man, especially the blurry facial features, which were extremely handsome. Su Li's heart moved, and he guessed who the man was. The audio file was a piece of eavesdropping data mixed with electric current noise. Su Lu lowered his head and listened carefully before taking off his earpiece. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Xiaodong, who was sitting back on the sofa. "Li Xiaozhu, the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, and also my big brother." Li Xiaodong's face was gloomy as he said, "Park Ji-ho was one of my men, but he was with him. That's why I said you did the right thing." At this time, Su Lu maintained his silence. Looking at the second generation of the 7 great families in front of him, his heart gave birth to a heavy sense of vigilance. The contact between Park Ji-ho and the young master of the Li family was completely investigated by this person. He just didn't know how he was able to take these photos and eavesdrop on his conversation. While Su Lu was looking at Li Xiaodong was also thinking quickly. His childhood experience had made him develop a very good habit. He would never look down on anyone. Although he had expressed his disdain for the crown prince of the Tai family in his conversation with Park Ji-ho at the intersection of Green Mountain, it was actually just a cover-up. The Tai family had the longest history the highest status, and the most secretive power among the 7 great families. How could Li Xiaotong not pay attention to Tai Ziyuan? He was different from his big brother, who was used to looking down on everyone in the world as trash. He only had Lin Banshan in his eyes. This young man with a knife in front of him, under the double pressure of the Federal Academy of Science and the Li family, still dared to fight back. Moreover, his counterattack was so sharp. He killed Park Ji-ho and went straight into his bedroom. If Li Xiaotong paid attention to Su Lu in the past because of the relationship between Tai Ziyuan and Su Lu, then after tonight, he decided to pay more attention to Su Lu. After calculating, Li Xiaotong didn't hesitate at all. With the decisiveness and straightforwardness of a businessman making a bet, he said directly, "Let's cooperate." Su Lu looked at the 25 or 26 years old young man in front of him. His 2 straight eyebrows, which were like flying knives, frowned and said, "I don't understand. What does the 7th young master of the Li family need from me? And what can you give me? Park Ji-ho betrayed you because the young master of the Li family could bring him more benefits. What benefits do you get from cooperating with me? After all, you are a member of the Li family. I heard that recording and know that right now, the Federal Academy of Science wants to get the data in the laboratory. I hope that you can stop all of this." Li Xiaotong said, "Those data are important to the Federation's new generation of mecha. I don't care, but that big brother of mine cares a lot. Because once the Federal Academy of Science really wants to take a stand in the presidential election, the pairing of Governor Ross and Senator Macklin will have a higher chance of winning. If Li Xiaozhu succeeds in this matter, for him, it will naturally be of great benefit. Hasn't the Li family always supported them? I don't even care who becomes the president of the Federation." Li Xiaotong's expression darkened. He said, "No matter who becomes the president, the 7 great families of the Federation will still be 7 great families. Even if Ross and Macklin succeed in the election, what does it have to do with me? The Li family is not mine. On the contrary, if they succeed..." Su Lu understood the other party's meaning. His brows furrowed extremely tightly. "Even if I can stop the data from leaking out of the laboratory and destroy the agreement between your family and that old fellow from the Federal Academy of Sciences, I might not be able to affect the general trend of the presidential election. That is natural. However, this is still a very powerful link." Li Xiaotong stood up and said slowly, "As long as it benefits Li Xiaozhu, I am willing to destroy it. What can you help me with?" Su Lu asked again, "If you need to escape after this, I can find a way for you and provide you with some funding." Of course, if you really have a relationship with the Tai family, you might not even care about this. However, I think that we can form some kind of long-term beneficial relationship because our goals seem to be somewhat the same. Li Xiaotong didn't say long-term friendship, but rather benefits. This was more believable. However, Su Lu still didn't say anything. Li Xiaotong looked at him quietly. After a while, he picked up his private encrypted phone and made a few calls. After being silent for a while, he smiled and said, "I can help you delay the news from Park Ji-ho for a while, so that they won't react immediately. According to the information I got, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, the written order from the board of directors of the Nutshell will come out. Then, your laboratory will be lost. You still have 9 hours. Got it," Su Lu said. "The problem is that I only have 9 hours. I don't have the ability to get the data out. If I keep it in the laboratory, it will be in the hands of the Federal Academy of Science. In that case, it won't be helpful for your plan." Li Xiaotong understood the hidden meaning in his words. He sighed helplessly, shook his head and said, "I am sorry. In fact, the Li family's influence on the Nutshell is very limited. I still don't know how those old guys managed to avoid the military and directly influence the board of directors. As for the research institute, I don't have access to some of the more important areas, so I can't help you in this regard. This is only the first cooperation. I believe that there will be opportunities in the future." Li Xiaotong said, "If there is a future, I won't ask for much. I just hope that you can find a chance to let me meet Tai Ziyuan." Su Lu was deep in thought. After a long time, he gently nodded. 8 hours before the deadline, Su Lu arrived at the 1st Military Academy and entered the Husk Institute's 3rd Department area. It was already late at night, But there were still a few laboratories in the institute that were brightly lit. Researchers would sometimes forget the beauty of the day in the middle of the night. Sulu took out his electronic keycard and entered the core area. Then, he walked along the quiet corridor toward the laboratory. In front of the last scanning channel, he slowly stopped his footsteps. He put his hand into the pocket of his military uniform and gripped the cold metal device tightly. Although the meeting with the seventh young master of the Li family, Li Xiaodong, was somewhat dangerous, in the end, it proved Su Li's intuition at the beginning. Park Ji-ho was indeed working for the Li family, but not for Li Xiaodong. In the eyes of the seventh young master of the Li family, the position of the head of the Li family was what he needed to consider the most. As for the overall benefit of the Li family, the development of the Federation mecha, and the results of the presidential election, none of these were in the mind of the gloomy young man. The cooperation seemed to be successful, but in reality, Su Lu couldn't help Li Xiaodong much. With Li Xiaodong's current strength, he couldn't help Su Lu either. And this cooperation was basically hidden under the surface, just a loose psychological connection. He pressed the small button and narrowed his eyes. A faint blue light began to emit from the small device in his pocket. It was blocked by the cloth of his military uniform and became even dimmer. Although it was dim, it was enough to envelop his entire body. There was not a single person in the quiet corridor. Sulu didn't hesitate or show any fear. He directly walked toward the scanning channel. A very strange thing happened at this moment. The Federation's most advanced scanning device seemed to have become blind and deaf at this moment. The faint blue light that enveloped Sulu seemed to have some kind of magic, turning Sulu invisible in front of these advanced monitoring devices. The device that was personally designed by Uncle Feng Yu was enough to temporarily fool the omnipotent central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation, let alone the secondary monitoring network at the edge of the charter. This was one of Su Li's biggest trump cards. Previously, he was able to sneak into the Ivy Garden and directly into Li Xiaodong's bedroom because of this small device in his pocket. This was the first time Su Lu tried to use this device in the core area of the Federation. The Husk Institute contained the most confidential information of the Federation. Without a doubt, the place with the strongest surveillance and defense was turned into a piece of trash by this small device. Walking to the familiar door of the laboratory, Su Lu wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and took a deep breath. The glory of the charter was spread all over the Federation. The people of the Federation, including those who were extremely meticulous, had long been accustomed to the power of technology over tens of thousands of years of history. They had developed a kind of mental inertia. This inertia provided endless convenience for Su Lu to lurk and wander in this society. Once the technology was broken, Su Lu seemed to vaguely capture the feeling of freedom that Uncle Feng Yu had. After entering the password and opening the door of the laboratory, Su Lu took out a heavy axe from the metal firebox next to him and silently walked in. Chapter 187. In the Federation, no one could cover the sky with one hand. The president couldn't, the old man from the Lees of Philadelphia couldn't, and the lady from the Tai family couldn't either. Everyone could at most cover the blazing sun in front of their eyes and clear up the sky above their heads. Money could do anything, but it wasn't omnipotent. Although the Lee family had already put all of their efforts into the presidential election, they were still careful and meticulous in their planning. They didn't let go of any link that could affect the voters. The Federation's new generation of mecha development involved the shameful agreement between Senator Macklin and Dean Lin, so they naturally wouldn't ignore it. However, even if the Federal Academy of Science and the Lee family worked together, they still couldn't completely influence the Shell Motor Company. Thus, they needed the data in the laboratory, but they still had to follow the rules of the game and wait for the written order to arrive. If that young second lieutenant really didn't have any background, or if he had naturally retreated under great pressure, perhaps Li Xiaozhu wouldn't be so distressed. The problem was that until today, he still didn't know how deep the relationship between that young second lieutenant named Sulu and the Tai family was. He had some misgivings, so his methods had some twists and turns. Thus, he let Park Ji-ho use those underhanded methods to temporarily remove that young second lieutenant from this matter. Park Ji-ho was one of Li Xiaodong's people. Li Xiaozhu didn't expect the knife he borrowed to be able to fool many people and make Old Seven uncomfortable, but at least he hoped it could be hidden for a while. His main concern was whether or not this knife was strong enough, sharp enough, and qualified enough to be used by him in the future. When his secretary told him of Park Ji-ho's death, he was sitting on the sofa by the window, looking at the thousands of lights below. The normal red wine in his hand swayed slightly. A trace of shock flashed through Li Xiaozhu's eyes, but it quickly returned to calmness. It seemed that the knife he had his eyes on wasn't tempered and broke so cleanly. He thought of that young second lieutenant again, and for a moment, he felt an inexplicable sense of vigilance. All of the good feelings he had accumulated during dinner were completely washed away. Li Xiaozhu shouldn't be wary of Su Lu. That was an outsider who had lost his way and entered the circle. He didn't have any foundation to speak of, and even more so, he couldn't be a threat to him. Even if the other party knew about their plan from Park Ji-ho, there was no time to stop the sealing of the laboratory tomorrow morning. The problem was that it was already 2:00 in the middle of the night. After the police found Park Ji-ho's body, they estimated that he died at 9:00 last night. Li Xiaozhu didn't have the habit of contacting his subordinates directly. Since it was a secret plan, Park Ji-ho wouldn't report it after it was done. Therefore, these few hours of idle time did not attract his attention. However, Park Ji-ho was dead. He should have been the first to know the news, but it seemed that some people had delayed it for a few hours. What can I do in a few hours? His extremely handsome face gradually turned cold as he gently turned the wine glass in his hand. Suddenly, he laughed self-deprecatingly and shook his head. After making a phone call, he no longer cared about this matter. Although the young second lieutenant was an unexpected variable, it couldn't affect the overall situation. That guy named Su Lu couldn't have stolen the data from the Husk Institute's laboratory. This had nothing to do with ability, but with the system. The Federation's system was always stronger than an individual's ability. The soft and pleasant sound of electric current was very clear in the quiet laboratory. In the Federation's cutting-edge technology laboratory with low-noise technology, if it weren't for Su Li's amazing hearing, he probably wouldn't have been able to hear this music-like sound. The index tree and data axis on the holographic screen quickly flipped, and the schematic of the file shredding continued to operate. Su Lu had already taken off his military uniform. His hands quickly entered the operation instructions on the holographic screen desktop. Beads of sweat covered his forehead. The design drawings and data model of the electron jet had basically been destroyed. This part of the data was the result of his recent cooperation with Professor Shen. It wasn't entered into the Federation's database management system, so it was very easy to delete. Plus, this was his own research, so even if it was destroyed, it wouldn't be too difficult to pick it up again in the future. The hissing sound of the file shredding was accompanied by the faint sound of electric current. It was like a simple but extremely beautiful concerto. Under the accompaniment of this song, Su Lu silently and wholeheartedly carried out his own work. This data had to be destroyed. Otherwise, if the Federal Academy of Science got their hands on it, with their terrifying research abilities, they might only need 3 days to solve the most critical problem of the new generation of mecha in the Federation. At 2:13 a.m., Su Lu finally raised his head from the holographic screen desktop. He let out a tired breath, feeling the aches all over his body and the hunger in his stomach. Tonight, he had first faced off against 7 Blades, then killed Park Ji-ho, then sneaked into the Ivy Garden. He had been using the mysterious power in his body all this time. Right now, although his spirit was still full and the mysterious power was still abundant, the wear and tear on his body and the emptiness in his stomach were truly making him uncomfortable. Outside the laboratory's database, all content related to the electron jet had been completely deleted. In order to erase all traces, Su Li's fingers didn't stop working for a moment. The database searching ability that had been forcefully trained by Professor Shen was put to good use at this moment. The data content was all outside the database. Presumably, the people who would take over the laboratory tomorrow morning would not notice anything strange. After doing all this, Su Lu sat in the chair beside the holographic screen desktop. He was silent for a minute, thinking for a minute, and resting for a minute. The trip to the Ivy Garden at least confirmed Zhou Yu's analysis in the black car. The Federal Academy of Science wanted Professor Shin's research results, and the Li family secretly helped. The bridge between them was Ross and Medellin, two politicians who were determined to win the presidency. This combination was truly frightening. Sulu naturally wouldn't completely trust Li Xiaodong's cooperation with him. In reality, the Li family's seventh young master, other than having some money, couldn't help him at all. However, the Li family's seventh young master was actually able to spy on Park Ji-ho and find evidence of his betrayal. This ability made Sulu a little wary. He deleted the hundreds of initial design blueprints that he and Professor Shin had come up with in the past few days, wiping out all traces of the data. There was no trace of relief on Suli's face. He stared at the index tree that flashed incessantly on the holographic screen desktop, a trace of heaviness and helplessness in his small eyes. The real key lay in the aspect of quantum measurable dynamics that Professor Shin had researched. The reason Sulu had found the correct path to solve the problem of the new generation MX Mecha's electronic jets was because of Professor Shin's guidance. Under the old man's tireless research in the last 10 years of his life, under the theories and data models, he had figured out some things. Although the results that Sulu had obtained now were important, the truly important ones were still Professor Shin's data models and the functional formulas within the sections. Right now, he had already destroyed all of the extension designs, but if the Federal Academy of Science took away all of Professor Shin's research results, he believed that it wouldn't take them too long to discover the problem and solve it. That highly respected head of the Federal Academy of Science, as well as those disciples and grand-disciples of his who occupied key positions in the Federation's scientific community, were definitely not incompetent people. Although Sulu despised the moral standards of these people, he had to admit that these people didn't rely entirely on plagiarism to get to where they were today. Their own abilities were also incomparably strong. The database of this laboratory was a one-way exit. It was connected to the core databases of the Federal Academy of Science and the three major military academies, but it couldn't be accessed from the outside. The entrance was only in that office on the second floor of the laboratory. That was why the Federal Academy of Science urgently needed control of this laboratory. Suli's initial plan was to directly transfer all of Professor Shin's academic results over the years directly through the data transfer device. Then, with the help of the blue light device, he would be able to pass through the triple scanning door of the Research Institute. Unfortunately, although the database in this laboratory was a one-way exit, for the sake of data security, old Professor Shin had connected it to the Federal Central Database and carried out electronic data security. No matter who it was, without the permission of the Central Database, once the data was copied or irreversible, it would be reported to the police. Now, there was a problem in front of Sulu. He couldn't move Professor Shin's data. It was extremely difficult, even if he wanted to quietly destroy the data. However, all of these data would fall into the hands of the Federal Academy of Science tomorrow. This was something that he absolutely didn't want to see. Sulu couldn't get the permission of the Central Database, but those people must have already thought of a countermeasure. Even if he couldn't quietly destroy the data, Sulu still had other ideas. However, he was still in a minute of silent contemplation. This was the fruit of wisdom that Professor Shun had spent countless years to obtain. If he destroyed it in his own hands, how would he explain it to that old man in the Milky Way public cemetery? There was another problem. Although Sulu was already familiar with many functional formulas and numerical models, if he didn't have the help of the data in Professor Shin's database, he didn't have a shred of confidence that he would be able to complete the final modification work of the new generation of mecha for the Federation. What did the Federation's new generation of mecha mean? Sulu understood this better than anyone else. Although he didn't have a shred of goodwill towards the upper echelons of society that controlled this Federation, he also knew that in the increasingly tense situation between the Federation and the Empire, the sooner the Federation completed the research and assembly of the new generation of mecha, the fewer normal, hot-blooded soldiers would die. On one side, it was direct justice and the resistance of the small fry. On the other side, it was the great benefits of the Federation and the lives of the common people. To stay or to be destroyed, that was the question. 1 minute later, Sulu stood up from his chair and stopped thinking about this question. He couldn't understand, so he could only act according to his instincts. From the database storage rack in the second-floor office, he pulled out the hard storage boxes that were connected to the data cables and power cables. Sulu looked at these metal objects and couldn't help but pause for a moment. He knew that his next action would destroy Professor Shin's lifetime of hard work. At this moment, he began to struggle in his mind. If it's not yours, then you shouldn't have snatched it. Sulu took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Fuck you." He spat on his hand, raised the heavy peace axe in his hand, and smashed it down viciously and decisively at those data storage boxes. Chapter 188. When Sulu made up his mind to do something, no one could stop him. He clearly knew that with this swing of the axe, it was possible that the Federation's research and development of the new generation of mecha would be pushed back by several years or even decades. However, he still smashed it down without any hesitation. This was based on the simple outlook of a mining orphan. If it wasn't yours, then you shouldn't fight for it. If you fight for it, then I will destroy it. Everything in this laboratory had been given to him by Professor Shen, so he dared to smash it. This was a kind of attitude. He would rather this piece of jade shatter so miserably than let others steal a single tile from him. Faint blue, incandescent, and serene electric sparks flew in all directions as the sharp axe chopped down heavily. Those hard alloy storage boxes were also reduced to countless sharp metal shards, flying in all directions of the laboratory. The high-density magnetic materials in the boxes were also reduced to patches of ink rain, tragically reduced to dust under the axe. With the current level of technology in the Federation, using technical means to erase data had the possibility of being recovered. After Sulu made up his mind last night, he decided to use this kind of barbaric, crude, and simple physical method to carry out data erasure. Those hard alloy surfaces could not be penetrated even by bullets. Even if a normal person dared to use physical methods like Sulu to carry out data erasure, they probably would not be able to find any way to do so. However, Sulu did. He had a heavy peace axe in his hand. His body was filled with a scorching, trembling power of injustice. The peace axe was raised high and brought down heavily. Sulu silently and violently destroyed everything on the data rack. However, he did not feel at ease as he smashed. Instead, his heart was filled with pain and deep sorrow. Every time the axe smashed down, a portion of data was destroyed. It was as if the axe was smashing down viciously on his body. Professor Shun had guarded this place for dozens of years, ignoring everything outside. He had only left this behind. Although he still did not obtain any results from this, he had left behind countless research fruits of wisdom in the process. At this moment, however, they were gradually disappearing under the heavy peace axe, just as Li Xiuzhu had envisioned. In the face of the Federation's powerful system, no one could steal the data in the Research Institute. Although Sulu had the precious legacy left to him by Uncle Fengyu, he couldn't do this. The Federation's protection of these data was unimaginable. However, what Li Xiuzhu didn't expect was that the young second lieutenant named Sulu would choose such a bloody way to destroy everything here once he realized that the data couldn't be transferred away. Sulu had no way to quietly remove the data, and he couldn't even secretly erase the data. In front of the Federal Academy of Science, the Iron Mathematicians, and the shadows of those political figures, there was no way for him to protect Professor Shun's legacy. The Tai family was still silent. He was just a researcher. What could he do? What he could do was what he was doing now, what the axe was doing when the peace axe hit the data storage box on the shelf for the first time, breaking the hard alloy surface and damaging the high-density magnetic material inside. The lights in the laboratory suddenly dimmed. Then, the emergency lights began to flash quickly. At the same time, a sharp alarm sounded. Immediately after, the alarm began to sound in the corridor outside the laboratory. It was sharp and ear-piercing. The sound was urgent and frightening. The alarm systems of the 3 departments of the Husk Institute were activated at the same time. The 3 scanning systems that led to the outside were in a state of emergency. All traffic was temporarily controlled. The automatic defense system also began to operate. The researchers who were still in the laboratory followed the instructions of the central control computer and walked out of the door of the laboratory. They looked at the alarm lights in the corridor in confusion. When they realized that it wasn't a fire alarm, they couldn't help but be confused. What happened? Why did the alarm sound so shrill? Immediately after, a series of rapid and dense heavy footsteps came from the end of the corridor of the research institute. A group of fully armed military police wearing dark-colored bulletproof vests ran over with serious expressions. They quickly surrounded the door of one of the laboratories. It was only then that the researchers noticed that the door to the lab was still closed. It was like it was in another world. That was old Professor Shin's lab? The military police had already connected to the intercom outside the laboratory, but there was no response from inside the laboratory. Only a series of heavy thumping sounds could be heard. It was as if a monster was smashing something in the laboratory. The leader of the military police frowned, waved his arms, and prepared to launch a strong attack. Sulu heard the alarm, but he didn't stop his actions. He even knew that the fully armed military police must have surrounded the laboratory at this time. Therefore, his movement of the axe became faster. Smash it! The shameless academic leader of the Federal Academy of Science had already made Professor Shin silent for a long time. How could he let him do it again this time? Professor Shin, who was lying in the grave, would probably support his actions. He would rather destroy all of this. One day in the future, there would be some great people in the Federation who were willing to guard this small building for decades. They would once again discover the things that Professor Shin had researched. Although it would be a little later, it was better than handing over these beautiful data models and functional formulas to those shameless people and using them as tools for their pursuit of fame and fortune. With a bang, the peace axe slammed into the ground, splashing out a few sparks. Sulu gasped for breath. He didn't have time to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He turned around and looked at the monitor screen. On the screen, the military police outside the laboratory had already begun to prepare to break in. What should be destroyed had been destroyed. The legacy left behind by Professor Shun had become fragments and splashes all over the ground. Sulu believed that the peace axe, attached to his own power, had done extreme physical damage. It would be extremely difficult for the masters of the Federal Academy of Science to recover the data. However, at this moment, Suli's eyes narrowed. His pupils shrank nervously. This was because he found a line of characters flashing on the screen. Core data has been successfully transferred. Temporarily saved in Area B. Suli's hand holding the peace axe trembled. He suddenly turned his head and stared at the row of backup storage devices behind the data rack. Suddenly, a strong sense of unwillingness and despair rose in his heart. Transferred. The heavy axe fell countless times and destroyed the data boxes. However, the data had been automatically transferred to Area B. Sulu looked at the flashing characters on the screen with a strange expression on his face. His whole body started to tremble. He knew that he had failed. The electronic security of the central database was stronger than he had imagined. He had clearly cut off the data line in advance, so how could the data be transferred from Area A to Area B without any problems? The strong sense of unwillingness and anger turned into disappointment and then despair. Sulu silently looked at the characters on the screen that indicated the successful transfer of data. He lowered his head and closed his eyes. He heard the sound of the laboratory door being broken open. He angrily said in a low voice, "Motherfucker." The central database of the Federation was in the Federal Central Computer. It was about 40 kilometers away from the Husk Institute's 3rd Division, deep underground in the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation. The light of the first charter shrouded the universe. Sulu wanted to erase the security data recorded by the Federal Central Computer with a peace axe. At this moment, it seemed so absurd. However, what Sulu did not expect was that for the Federal Central Computer, the information node behind his neck was no stranger to the message sent by the Federal Central Computer. What was even more incredible was that after the strange second type of connection, no one in the Federation knew that the omnipotent Central Computer had established an observation system for Sulu and reserved a data reciprocation channel. In the quiet night, deep underground, A line of characters quietly appeared at the bottom of the 2D display screen of the Federal Central Computer. Citizen number, SLAT 510200431X. Information node is abnormal. Name, Sulu. Note, suspect number 72 with abnormal situation. Note, number 1 type of contact target. Note, this citizen is the first long-term observation target. Before the 5-person team replies, ensure the survival of this target's data. Note, the data reciprocation channel has been connected. Establish active contact to repair abnormal status. Do you accept? Humans had resentment and unwillingness. Violent fluctuations in the mind could cause humans to erupt with great potential in an instant, or cause the body to fall into a strange state. Sulu did not. He just stared fixedly at the holographic screen and continuously cursed his mother in the central database. At this moment, he did not know that the central database was the first charter computer that he feared the most. However, his anger followed his heart. His anger, his despair, the torment of the night, and the mental exhaustion caused the burning torrent in his body to rapidly return from its state of spreading in his limbs to his back and waist. When it passed through the back of his neck, it vaguely touched something and produced a sharp pain. At this moment, the door of the laboratory had already opened. The fully armed military police had already rushed in. They aimed the guns in their hands at Sulu and were shouting something loudly. However, Sulu felt a pain in the back of his neck. Then, he realized that the movements of the military police had become extremely slow. Was there something wrong with his eyes? No, it was a black eye. He was shocked to find that his eyes had turned black and he had fallen into a strange and familiar state. He had fallen into a black dream again. A line of white symbols of light came from afar and entered his eyes. Establish active contact. Do you accept? Suli's entire body was cold. In an instant, who knew how many past events he thought of? After a moment of confusion, he asked with a trembling heart, "Who are you?" After a long silence, the symbols of light turned into a line of words. Chapter 189. For a baby, everything outside the cradle was what he feared and yearned for the most. For a child, everything outside the room was what he feared and yearned for the most. For ancient humans, everything on the other side of the mountain was what they feared and yearned for the most. For modern citizens of the Federation, the universe at the end of the black curtain sky was what they feared and yearned for the most. What humans feared the most, what they yearned for the most, were all in the unknown. Right now, Sulu was caught in this dual state of extreme fear and yearning. Fully armed military police had already rushed in. He was about to be arrested, but he didn't have time to think about these things, because right now, he had already returned to the black dream. He saw the repeatedly flashing words about taking the initiative to contact. What was on the other side of the black dream? Why did the other side take the initiative to contact him? What was taking the initiative to contact him? This was definitely not an illusion, but it was already about to scare Sulu. This was definitely not epilepsy, but Sulu truly felt like he was about to go crazy. In the past, he had always thought that the dark dream and the blueprints that were lurking in his mind were all problems caused by the disguised chip that Uncle Fengyu had left him. However, at this moment, he finally had some other thoughts. The existence on the other side of the black dream seemed to have intelligence and could answer, but he didn't know what kind of existence it was. Mechanic Fengyu, the first person involved in the Bureau of Proclamation incident, was, without a doubt, the greatest monster of the Federation in the past 100 years. However, even this monster, when faced with the young Sulu, deeply sighed in admiration. This person's calmness was even greater than his talent as a mechanic. If an ordinary person were to face such a situation, they would have already fallen to the ground in fear, but Sulu was still standing there, thinking, accept. After a long or short period of consideration, Sulu made this decision in his mind almost subconsciously. There was something that could enter one's mind and communicate with one's mind. This kind of panic was something that no one could bear in such a short time. Sulu understood, but he didn't understand. However, in addition to his fear, he developed a boundless curiosity towards the existence at the end of the Black Dream. This was a professional quirk that had been cultivated as an engineer since childhood, and it was also a gamble that his current situation prompted him to make. The peace axe hacked in all directions, but the central database, through a method that Sulu could not understand, transferred all the data models and functional formulas related to quantum dynamics to Area B. Fully armed military police had already rushed in, and he was about to be arrested. He would no longer be able to stop that shameless agreement between the Federal Academy of Science and the Iron Calculator. Trapped in despair, he suddenly entered the Black Dream again and encountered the unknown. This could be a variable, it could be an opportunity, it could be endless danger, but he still gambled. He gambled so decisively that he didn't care at all about the conflicting emotions that welled up in the depths of his heart the moment he entered the Black Dream. Sulu was a gambler. On the contrary, he was never willing to gamble on anything. However, at this moment, he had already lost everything. Other than his own life, there was nothing else to lose. If he didn't gamble now, when would he? Sulu didn't know that when he chose to accept the active communication in his mind, deep in the ground tens of kilometers away from the third department of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, on the central computer light screen that shone all over the universe, there was a wave that made one's mind shake. The data flow of the central computer was still so stable. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation didn't notice anything strange. No one knew that in the core area of the central computer, the highest intelligence of the human mechanical civilization began to operate nonstop. It made logical judgments, but in the end, it could only return to chaos and give its own conclusion. In the Black Dream, the line of white characters changed. "Is there anything I can help you with?" This was a long line of white characters. It floated in the black background before Sulu's eyes. Although it was silent and abnormally dry, it miraculously produced some kind of emotional resonance. It was like an old butler wearing a black suit was bowing in front of Sulu. It was extremely polite and slightly humble. It used an authentic ancient aristocratic tone to ask questions. Sulu was stunned. He was thinking about what kind of existence was on the other side of the Black Dream. He didn't expect that this existence that could invade his brain would be so gentle. "I want to erase all the data in this laboratory. You need to provide the legal documents of ownership recognized by the Federation." When Sulu made this request, he didn't expect the existence on the other side of the Black Dream to help him do it. Because even physical damage couldn't destroy the data under the monitoring of the central database. However, the owner of those characters was like a lawyer. It made a reasonable response. For a moment, Sulu was stunned. He thought of a possibility. He thought of his bet. Subconsciously, he thought that this strange existence that invaded his brain might really be omnipotent. "I stored the legal documents in the computer in room 413 of the Wangdu Prefectural Ming Apartments." With just a few words, Sulu had gradually gotten used to this way of conversing with his thoughts. After saying this, he prayed in his heart that this guy who invaded his brain could see those legal documents. Almost instantly, the line of characters changed again. "Legal authority confirmed. Please confirm if you want to erase it immediately." "No, I want to transfer these data." Sulu's eyes were extremely round. He didn't know if they could appear in the Black Dream. He stared at the line of white characters and suddenly thought of the importance of Professor Shen's data. He said loudly in his mind, "Countless characters, countless numbers, and countless incomprehensible models and formulas in the form of pictures fell from the sky like a waterfall. Sometimes it was gentle, sometimes it fell violently. It fell in front of Sulu's eyes. These were all the core data of Professor Shen's laboratory. Like a waterfall, they washed over Sulu's eyes and entered his mind. He felt that the black space was gradually becoming unstable. He could also feel that his brain was beginning to swell and hurt, and it was beginning to numb. "Data transfer successful. Confirm to erase the original data? No. Can you help me change the things inside?" Human desires were endless. just like the fisherman in the ancient fairy tale. Since Sulo had already made a bet and actively communicated with the existence that invaded his brain, although he was still terrified, he still didn't know what the other party was, and he didn't know what kind of situation he was about to face. Then, why didn't he ask the other party to do more? Fortunately, the terrifying and omnipotent existence at the end of the black dream didn't leave in disappointment like the goldfish in the waves. It only silently and quickly completed the task that Sulu gave it. The military police didn't know what happened in the laboratory. When they rushed into the laboratory, they only saw the shattered metal pieces all over the floor, and the data rack that had been damaged to the extent that it was difficult to repair. The young researcher who destroyed the laboratory seemed to be scared silly by the terrifying weapons in the hands of the military police. He stood there in a daze, motionless. The heavy Taiping axe had long fallen to the ground. The military police swarmed forward and pressed the young researcher, who didn't resist, to the ground. They used high-strength plastic rope to tie his hands tightly behind his back. Only then did they let out a slight sigh of relief. However, immediately after that, they found that the young researcher's face was frighteningly pale. They couldn't help but feel a little strange. What was even stranger was that the young researcher's eyes were a little strange. From the moment the military police rushed in until he was pushed to the ground, this person's eyes didn't blink, especially the pupil, which had shrunk into a black dot. It looked extremely terrifying, like a dead person. The military police captain touched Su Li's neck and confirmed that this person was alive. He couldn't help but frown. After hearing the orders from his superior through the communication device, his expression suddenly became serious. He signaled his subordinates to take this audacious guy who dared to destroy the Federation's confidential data out of the door of the laboratory. Just as the group of people walked out of the laboratory with serious expressions, Su Lu, who was sandwiched between two military police, finally woke up slowly. His pupils gradually returned to normal, but his pale face didn't improve for a while. A trace of confusion, a trace of joy, a trace of determination, and a trace of fear flashed through Su Li's eyes. All the data in Professor Shin's laboratory had been transferred into his brain, and the unknown existence had done some tampering with the backup data in the laboratory according to his thoughts. Everything was wonderful, but he didn't know where this wonderful feeling came from. Naturally, he felt fear in his heart. The process of the data stream entering his brain, as well as the process of the final call and confirmation, made Sulu understand one thing. The black dream he experienced in the 1st Military Region's General Hospital and the structural blueprints he saw were exactly the same as today's experience. This was definitely not caused by the chip Uncle Feng Yu left for him. Then, at the end of the black dream, what exactly was it? To be able to instantly confirm the electronic legal documents he left in the apartment in Wangdu, to be able to ignore the defenses of the Federation's central database, to easily transfer and even modify the electronically protected data in the laboratory, and to be able to transmit this data into his brain through some mysterious means, that thing could invade his brain and do so many unimaginable things. It was so mechanical yet seemed to have a life of its own. It seemed to be omnipresent and omnipotent. Sweat dampened his hair and draped it weakly on his forehead. Surrounded by fully armed military police, he walked along the long corridor toward the military vehicle under the astonished gazes of his colleagues in the research institute. Sulu didn't have the slightest fear of being arrested and the subsequent hardships because his mind had long been completely occupied by the fear of the unknown great existence. Chapter 190. Su Li's face was pale, and his body was trembling. In the eyes of the military police captain, this scene was naturally a sign of fear. The military police captain had a phone call with his superiors earlier, and he also lived in the research institute on a regular basis. Naturally, he knew why this young second lieutenant ran to Professor Shin's lab and smashed it. He looked at Su Lu with a trace of pity, thinking that this young second lieutenant was quite brave. Facing the pressure of the technical director of the board of directors, he actually dared to not hand over the lab, and even raised an axe to smash the data rack. This kind of fierceness made the military officer, who knew the inside story, admire him. Admiration was only a feeling deep in his heart. After receiving the order from his superiors, the military police captain knew that this person had gotten into big trouble. For a moment, he still didn't know how this person passed the 3 scans and sneaked into the lab, but he only knew that what awaited Su Lu would be a merciless military court trial, destroying the core confidential data of the Federation. What kind of crime was this? Fortunately, the central control computer of the Research Institute's 3rd department had already confirmed that the core data of Professor Shin's lab had been electronically protected. The moment it was destroyed, it was successfully transferred to Area B. If that data was destroyed, he would probably be sentenced. The military police captain felt a chill in his heart. At this time, looking at the cold, sweat-drenched and silent Su Lu, he didn't have the slightest sympathy. Instead, it added a bit of coldness. At the entrance of the 1st Military Academy, Su Lu was escorted to a military vehicle by fully armed military police. The military vehicle drove along the quiet and dark road of the Capital Special District into the distance, silent all the way. After getting on the military vehicle, Su Li's ankles were also tied with a high-strength plastic rope. The military police had obviously received orders from their superiors to lock him up as a serious criminal. The military vehicle was very quiet along the way, and Su Lu was also silent. He was a smart person, completely opposite to his honest and ordinary appearance. His intelligence surpassed most people in the Federation. Otherwise, Feng, you wouldn't have chosen him back then. Therefore, he clearly knew what kind of terrifying power the existence that had invaded his brain at the other end of the black dream possessed. Furthermore, he deduced an extremely terrifying conclusion from the other party's ability. If the thing that had helped him transfer and modify the laboratory data was really the existence that he had guessed, it would be too unbelievable. It was so unbelievable that he didn't want to believe his own theory, even if it was the only possibility. Perhaps it was because of the worry and fear in his heart, or perhaps it was because of the extreme hunger in his stomach. Su Li's lips didn't have any color of blood. They were dry and white. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips slightly. Suddenly, he said to the silent military police in the military vehicle, "Brothers, do you want to smoke a whole cigarette?" The gendarme sitting next to him was stunned. He didn't expect that this guy, who had just gotten out of his daze, would want to smoke without a trace of fear. Did he not know that he had committed a serious crime? The military policeman subconsciously glanced at the captain, who was sitting in front of him with his eyes closed. The captain was resting with his eyes closed. Hearing Su Li's words, the captain opened his eyes and nodded. Su Lu raised his hands, accepted the lit cigarette, and said thank you. His hands were tightly tied together. It was a bit difficult to bring the cigarette to his lips. He greedily took a deep drag of the cigarette. The filter of the cigarette was still between his lips. He immediately took a second drag. Smoke filled the military vehicle. The gendarme sitting next to him, and across from him, gave him a strange look. They thought that this second lieutenant probably knew that he could be shot, so he treated this cigarette as the last one to smoke. The slightly dry and strong smoke poured into Su Li's lungs. It could calm the mind and satisfy one's spiritual needs. Only now did Su Li's complexion gradually improve. Destroying the Federation's confidential data was equivalent to treason. Not to mention, he had killed an active Federation officer on Tiger Mountain Road in the middle of the night. However, Su Lu wasn't thinking about these things at all. His hands and feet were bound by high-strength plastic rope. This special high-strength plastic had long replaced metal handcuffs and was used in large quantities by the federal military and police. For the Federation government, this high-strength plastic was enough to bind all normal humans to death. However, no one would have thought that in the countless galaxies of the Federation, there would always be a few abnormal humans. Back in the Donglan district, Su Lu had once used his own strength to break this high-strength plastic rope. He believed that he wasn't the only abnormal human in the Federation. Uncle Feng Yu was one, and presumably, that old man in the Lees of Philadelphia was also one. However, Su Lu didn't have the thought of breaking the plastic rope, suddenly killing people, flipping the car, escaping prison, and becoming a fugitive from the Federation again. Black dreams, active connections, characters, countless blueprints, and green data streams like a waterfall. Sulu stared at the flame of the cigarette in front of him and took a deep breath. Previously, he had already moved the pictures in his mind and confirmed that the core data and formulas in Professor Shin's laboratory had all been transferred to his mind by that existence. How did a huge amount of data transfer into his brain so quickly? Was it through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network of the Federation? Could he still be considered a normal human right now? Sulu closed his eyes tightly, and the cigarette between his dry lips gradually shortened. He kept trembling slightly, and the ash fell on his knees and was blown to the floor by the wind. After escaping from the Donglan district, he specifically studied the 740,000 words of the First Charter because that was the existence he was most afraid of. The glory of the First Charter shone on the Federation, but under the First Charter, only one-way data flows could ever be carried out. The five-person group's regulations were to cut off all the ways that the central computer affected the chips in the human body due to logic chaos. Why could he accept the data in reverse? That existence had entered the data twice, which was equivalent to invading the human brain. This was a serious violation of the highest rules of the First Charter. Why would this kind of logic error appear in that cold computer program? Active connections, accept? Sulu thought of the light talisman that had appeared many times in the hospital and in the laboratory. He couldn't help but close his eyes and think, I chose to accept before. So that existence actively invaded my brain? He couldn't understand, so he stopped thinking. Sulu slowly opened his eyes. The fear, confusion from before had long disappeared. He didn't need to care about that black dream, didn't need to care about what was wrong with that cold central computer, didn't need to care about whether the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was weaving some kind of conspiracy. He wasn't even afraid of death, so what was there to be afraid of? At this moment, he only knew that in the battle for data in the laboratory, he had inexplicably gained an overall advantage. The initiative to develop the new generation mecha of the Federation had once again returned to his hands, or perhaps it should be said that it had returned to his mind. Tonight, he had single-handedly defeated the Federal Academy of Science, defeated the Iron Schemer, and defeated Macklin. That was enough. He should say thank you, right? The cigarette had burned to the end, and the burnt smell of the filter sponge was very pungent. Sulu used his tongue to wet his lower lip, and only then did the dry stick of the cigarette fall off the dry skin on his lips and fall to the ground. He moved his bound feet with some difficulty and stepped on the cigarette to extinguish it. Then, he took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and looked at the military prison gate of the Department of Defense that was getting closer and closer. The prison gate was brightly lit. The Federation soldiers who had already received the order frowned and looked at the prisoner being escorted out of the car. They didn't know what crime this soldier had committed to be escorted to the prison for serious criminals. Sulu was escorted out of the military vehicle. Looking at the Federation soldiers around him who were on guard, he moved slowly with great difficulty. His eyes narrowed, and through those blinding searchlights, he looked at the gradually setting moon in the night sky. He thought of Professor Shun in the cemetery under the moon and smiled happily, the capital spaceport. The two moons that were slowly moving in the night sky occupied two remote corners of the field of vision. The silver moonlight was completely suppressed by the lights in the spaceport. A streamlined spaceship quietly docked in the light, and a few middle-aged officials gathered below the spaceship. The highly respected Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science finally finished the warship space portal test on the moon base and returned to Planet S1 accompanied by several government officials. Dean Lin walked in the front. His hair was white. 11 days of continuous low-gravity environment made the old man's body a little uncomfortable, and his face was slightly gloomy. His position in the Federation was extraordinary and noble. No matter how the president was replaced, he had already been in the position of the dean of the Federal Academy of Science for 17 years. Even if he had been in the toilet for 17 years, he could still make the toilet his own, not to mention the Federal Academy of Science. Secretary Luo, who followed behind, knew that Dean Lin's expression was not because of the trip to the moon. He silently dragged behind the team, but the corner of his eye was paying attention to the blue light of the communicator in his jacket pocket. The phone rang. Secretary Luo slowed down his footsteps and walked further away from the crowd before answering the call. Data confirmed safe. A sincere smile appeared on Secretary Luo's face. After hanging up the phone, he sped up and walked to the front of the team. When he walked to the front of the old man, he nodded imperceptibly. The officials accompanying Dean Lin found that the old man seemed to have adapted to the change in gravity. His face was much better, and they were immediately relieved. In a small room next to the top floor of the Capital Sanlin United Bank building, Secretary Liu put down the phone, walked to the president's office, whispered a few words, and was ready to go home. Li Xiuzhu, who was sitting on the chair, shook his head. Although he was very satisfied with this result, he really didn't expect that the young second lieutenant named Su Lu would actually be so valiant, to the point of crazily raising an axe and charging into the laboratory. Fortunately, the data was connected to the central database. Li Xiuzhu's extremely handsome face showed a trace of tiredness. When he thought about the silence of the old man from the Federal Academy of Science, his tiredness turned into a sarcastic smile. Then he called his father and informed him of this matter. Then he dialed another number. Li Xiuzhu really admired the councilman on the other end of the phone because he had never seen anyone who was more like a natural politician than that person. He was able to connect the interests of various parties through an insignificant matter. This should be a natural ability, and Li Xiuzhu admitted that he couldn't do it. Senator Medellin, congratulations. In an ordinary apartment in the capital, Senator Medellin's secretary, Helen, rushed into the bedroom with a trace of lust in her eyes. Tonight, the senator stayed in the office, so her date with him was delayed until late at night. Fortunately, Senator Medellin let her go, or else she was worried that he would leave in anger. What makes you so happy? There was a box of Noble 37 brand cigarettes on the bedside. The man slightly narrowed his eyes and looked at Helen. His handsome face, lazy expression, and peach blossom eyes were really fascinating. At least, he fascinated Helen, an old virgin with an ordinary face, to death. Helen giggled and directly pounced on him. She said seductively, "If you can make me unable to sleep tonight, I will tell you. For many people, this must be a sleepless night." Chapter 191. In the wee hours of the morning, the snow-white bedding on the big bed in the apartment was very messy, and the air was filled with the faint smell of chestnut flowers. A woman in her 30s was sitting in front of the bed, looking at the mirror on the dressing table. She squinted her eyes and smeared the lipstick on her lips. Her eyes were full of laziness after lust. She was only wearing a small lace underwear. Her smooth back, enchanting curves, and full buttocks were especially alluring because of the way she was sitting. Shi Qinghai lit a cigarette and looked at Helen's smile in the mirror. Other than him, not many people knew that the confidential secretary in Senator Macklin's office hid such a mature and seductive body under the gray formal dress. After taking off her glasses, the secretary released the lust that she had been suppressing for many years. There was a sense of infatuation in her bones. Helen's face in the mirror looked a little tired, but it was the kind of tired that was satisfied. On her dignified face, only the small wrinkles in between her eyebrows revealed her true age and her usual strict and reserved side. "Darling, I'm going to take a shower." Helen had to rush to Parliament Hill at 8 o'clock. Her work was much busier than the average person's. After the madness last night, she only had time to sleep for 2 hours before she had to leave again. She turned her head and looked charmingly at Shi Qinghai, who was smoking at the head of the bed. She smiled, put on a bathrobe, and walked into the bathroom. After closing the bathroom door, the warm water sprinkled down. Helen stood under the water, holding her face that was still a little hot. She raised her head and let the hot water wash over her naked and sensitive body. Her thoughts had already moved away from the pleasure that the man brought her to other places. Her eyes revealed a trace of reluctance, doubt, and self-comfort. She knew that she was not attractive when she was a secretary, especially when she had an ordinary face. Why did the man outside who fascinated her take a fancy to her, a woman who was already over 30 years old? As Senator Macklin's secretary, she had the needs of a normal person. She was also obsessed with the strange impact that the fancy man brought. Even so, she remained calm. She had already observed for a month, and she would continue to observe. If it was as she expected, she had no choice but to apologize to that man. Hearing the sound of running water coming from the bathroom, Shi Qinghai suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes, which were full of infinite attraction, moved to the phone quietly placed on the dressing table. Shi Qinghai gently placed the half-burnt cigarette on the ashtray and quietly walked to the dressing table. He looked at the phone that reflected a metallic luster on the wooden table. He keenly noticed that there were two extremely thin strands of hair in the black keyboard area below the phone. Two extremely thin strands of black hair gently rested on the black keyboard area. If one didn't pay special attention, they definitely wouldn't notice it. Moreover, the placement of these two strands of black hair was also very particular. Shi Qinghai glanced at the closed bathroom door and smiled. He carefully moved the two strands of hair away and opened the back cover of his cell phone. Perhaps because she was in a hurry to get to Parliament Hill, Secretary Helen's shower time was much shorter than the last few times she had sex with Shi Qinghai. She wrapped her hair in a white bath towel and walked out. She smiled and said, "Dear, what do you want to eat? There should be enough time to fry 2 pieces of bread." There was no one in the bedroom. Helen's voice stopped indifferently. She walked to the bedside with a complicated expression. She counted the cigarette butts in the ashtray and then walked to the dressing table. The two extremely thin strands of black hair still rested on the black keyboard area of the metallic phone. Helen's expression suddenly relaxed. Her right hand moved away from her wet head and lightly patted her naked chest. She was a little scared, but also a little satisfied. Fried bread is not nutritious enough. The masters of the trade office are not that easy to serve. A concerned voice came from the door. Shi Qinghai was half naked, wearing only casual shorts. He held a frying pan in his left hand. The eggs inside were being baked under the residual heat and gradually solidified. He held a wooden spatula in his right hand and a half-smoked cigarette in his mouth. Looking at the mesmerizing appearance of this man, coupled with the fact that she was gradually beginning to believe him, Helen spontaneously felt a sense of warmth and relaxation. Suddenly, she felt a little ashamed that she had been using the trade office secretary as a cover for her real job. She walked up and hugged Shi Qinghai's body tightly. She slowly twisted her body and said infatuatedly, "Lulu, I want to eat you in the morning." Shi Qinghai held the frying pan and the wooden spatula high, afraid that the naked body of the woman in his arms would be burned. Feeling the slide of the woman in front of his chest, he couldn't help but feel a little moved. He spat the cigarette, but on the floor and lowered his head to kiss her. The faint smoke of the number 37 brand cigarette began to swirl between the lips and tongues of this man and woman. It began to diffuse into the air and covered the true face and heart of each other. Sulu didn't know that the shameless brother who didn't know that he was already a father was using the most shameless method to approach Senator Macklin step by step. He also didn't know that the fake name Mr. Schur, who had a pair of peach blossom eyes, was actually related to him. Otherwise, he might have been very angry. At this time, he was locked up alone in a military prison. He didn't know the name of this military prison, but since it was in the Capital Special District and the security measures were so strict, the level of this prison must not be too low. This was a single cell. The high-strength plastic ropes on his hands and feet were not removed. It seemed that after tonight, the other party was very clear about Su Li's ability and dared not to be the slightest bit careless. This cell was entirely made of plastic, including the bed. The light from the corridor outside the grill shone in, making this place seem particularly lonely. Su Lu was lying on the bed, his tightly bound hands flat in front of his chest. His mind was in a mess, and his mind was clear at the same time. Every time he thought of the cold existence at the end of the black dream, his mind was a little confused. He had learned from Uncle Fengyu since he was young, read all the books in Hushi State University, and spent so many days in the Husk Institute. He was sure that the technology level of the Federation was tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, of years away from the appearance of artificial intelligence. However, the central computer under the Bureau of Proclamation seemed to have been in operation since the time of the Group of Five. The history before the catastrophe had long been lost in the long river of chaos. The computer had been in operation until now, but it hadn't been pulled apart by the gradual development of human society's technology. This was a very scary fact in itself. Although the first charter stated that the Federal Central Computer had been constantly improving and upgrading, subconsciously, Sulu didn't believe this. However, the ability to learn and upgrade by oneself was not artificial intelligence. He thought of the conversation in the Black Dream and couldn't help but frown. If the central computer didn't actively help him, then could it be that the big shots in the Bureau of Proclamation did something? Thinking of the mysterious and ancient Bureau of Proclamation, Su Li's chaotic mind was even more confused. He didn't like this feeling of confusion, so he began to analyze his current situation and gradually calmed down. Destroying the Federation's confidential data was definitely a serious crime. If someone accused him of being a spy, perhaps the military court would sentence him to death immediately. If he was found to be involved in Park Ji-ho's death at the entrance of Husan Mountain, the only thing he would receive in return would still be a death sentence. The sober Sulu didn't seem to be worried about this. He quietly looked at the shiny plastic ceiling and calculated the time in his mind. He wanted to see if the lady of the Tai family was willing to take a gamble. The data in the laboratory was related to the development of the new generation of mecha in the Federation. It was very important, and the benefits were not small, especially when it was related to the presidential election. Even if Lady Tai didn't want to stand up for a small character like herself, she still had to consider for Representative Pabre. The most important problem now was that Lady Tai needed to make a decision. After Sulu was arrested, it seemed that he couldn't control the data in the laboratory anymore. If she made a move now, it might be too late. The synonym for too late was often to give up. Sulu understood this very well, so he wanted to see if the other party was willing to bet that he still had something in his hands. Even if Lady Tai gave up on him, Sulu wouldn't fall into despair because Zoyu had already returned to the compound of the Ministry of Defense. Moreover, he still had a metal bracelet on his wrist. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but sigh softly as he lay on the bed. Other than the structural diagram of the little blue device, the most important thing in the bracelet was those strange maps. In the past, he didn't understand why Uncle Fengyu kept those maps like they were treasures. It wasn't until today when he was arrested and locked up in the military prison that he started to understand. Uncle, how many times were you arrested by the Federation in the past? And how many times did you escape prison? He praised with mixed feelings. The door of the cell was opened. Two soldiers escorted Sulu along the quiet corridor and walked out. It was still early in the morning. The prisoners in the cells on both sides of the corridor had just woken up. They looked at the newcomer in confusion, wondering if he was going to be executed directly since he was taken out so early. As soon as he thought of this, the corridor fell silent. There was actually no sound of jeering or strange shouting. Sulu sat at one end of the metal table and looked at the soldier in the distance who had lowered his head. He couldn't see the soldier's face clearly. He frowned slightly. The military prison was naturally under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Defense. If it was Deputy Minister Zhou who sent someone here, it would make sense. However, this reaction speed was faster than he had expected. Moreover, the person who sent him surprised him a little. The soldier heard the noise and slowly raised her head, revealing an unfamiliar but beautiful face. She said in a clear voice, "My name is Su Songzi. I belong to the legal department of the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense. I have been assigned to provide legal support to Second Lieutenant Su Lu." This was a female civilian officer. She was very beautiful. After she raised her body from the table, it could be seen that her body was also very beautiful. Sulu moved his body with some difficulty. He squinted his eyes and said, "Thank you." The female officer Su Songzi looked at Sulu and suddenly said coldly, "Destroying the core secrets of the Federation is a serious crime. The starting sentence is 3 years. The highest sentence can be death. If you don't want to be prosecuted for espionage, I advise you to plead guilty. This way, I can try to plead with the judge in the military court. Su Lu confirmed that the other party was sent by Deputy Minister Zhou because the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense happened to be the department directly under Zhou Yingxing. But for some reason, this female legal officer named Su Songzi didn't seem to have any good intentions towards him. I don't plead guilty. Su Songzi lowered her head. There was a trace of anger and mockery on her face. Although it was only midnight, the surveillance video and testimony provided by the Husk Institute were very complete. It seemed that the second lieutenant in front of her was so stupid that he relied on his background in the Ministry of Defense. Didn't he know that even if he was Deputy Minister Zhou's son-in-law, he couldn't be completely fine under such circumstances? I advise you to be sober. I'm very sober, but I think that before you came, you didn't do your research properly. Su Lu looked at the female officer on the other side of the long metal table. He lowered his head and said, "You probably don't know. That laboratory is mine. I've been having diarrhea for the past few days, and it's especially serious today. I've already become Wu Lao Air. My whole body is weak, and I really can't take it anymore. The leader has bought some medicine, and I've already taken it. I should be fine, but I'm only able to write one chapter today." Chapter 192. Su Songzi looked at the young second lieutenant at the other end of the long metal table in shock. She had graduated from the 1st Military Academy's Law Department 2 years ago and had performed very well in the Department of National Defense's Internal Affairs Department. She had never encountered a case that made her back off. However, in the middle of the night, she was woken up by a call from her immediate superior, who ordered her to immediately rush to the military prison to provide legal support for a client. Suddenly receiving such a strange order and being disturbed from her sleep naturally put her in a bad mood. When she saw the witness and material evidence provided by the Nutshell Research Institute and the Military Police Brigade, the displeasure in her heart reached its peak. A suspect officer who could get the Department of National Defense to voluntarily provide legal support in the middle of the night was undoubtedly someone with a strong background. In her eyes, this young second lieutenant named Su Lu was just one of the countless playboys in the Federation. However, this playboy was especially stupid. She didn't know what ridiculous reason he had, but he actually caused a ruckus in the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute. These people really didn't know how to spell the word death. With prejudice in front of her, she naturally didn't have a good attitude towards Su Lu. However, due to her professionalism, she still seriously provided the other party with reference opinions and persuaded the other party to admit his guilt. However, she didn't expect that the suspect officer across the long table would directly reject her and even give a reason that she didn't think of before. "The lab is yours?" Su Songzi was stunned, then immediately laughed sarcastically. She quietly looked at Su Lu across the long table and said, "I didn't hear wrong, right?" After she graduated from the 1st Military Academy, she directly entered the Department of National Defense's Internal Affairs Department. Her performance was extremely outstanding, and she was deeply appreciated by her superiors. However, because of the limited research area, she didn't know who the authority of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute belonged to. She only knew that the Federation's Research Institute, which controlled a considerable amount of cutting-edge technology, belonged to the Federation and the military. However, this person actually said that the lab was his. Su Lu felt this female officer's attitude towards him, so he lowered his head and said, "You can check the agreement between the Institute and Professor Shen." From the beginning of the establishment of this lab, a cooperative model was chosen. Starting from the 54th year of the constitutional calendar, all the sponsorship was obtained by Professor Shen in his own name. From this point of view, everything in this lab, including the data that I destroyed, can only be paid by the Federation or the Shell Company according to the agreement. They have the right to use, but they don't have the right to dispose of it. Su Songzi listened to these words, and her expression gradually calmed down. She realized that she really didn't know much about the Husk Institute. The other party seemed to be very organized, and it didn't seem like he was lying. Moreover, he was already arrested and imprisoned, so lying to her at this time wouldn't do him any good. Before Professor Shin passed away, through a notarized will, the right to dispose of the lab was fully transferred to me. Sulu raised his head, looked at the beautiful female officer across the long table, and said calmly, "The spare parts of the legal documents are in my apartment. You can check them at any time, if no one destroys them." Su Songzi heard the confidence hidden in the young second lieutenant's calm words. She slightly frowned, lowered her head, and looked at the file on the table again. She slowly said, "In the statements of the Institute and the military police, this point was not mentioned. Of course, I will immediately verify it. But if what you said is true, then I don't understand why you destroyed the confidential data in the lab. You should know that those data are important data that has been electronically protected by the central database of the Federation." Her gaze paused on the file, and she couldn't help but shake her head lightly. What kind of officer was this? He actually carried a peace axe and barged into the Institute and smashed up a lab. These data are mine. Do I need to explain how I want to dispose of them? At this time, Sulu naturally wouldn't tell the female officer about the Federal Academy of Science, the Iron Schemer, and the new generation of mecha from the Federation. This wouldn't do him any good in his current situation. In fact, it would only make things worse. Thank you very much for coming to provide me with legal aid. I think I've already made myself very clear. The data is mine, and the lab is mine. Since that's the case, there is no reason for me to still be locked up in prison. I want to know, when can I get out? Su Songzi didn't raise her head. She pushed the file in front of her away, opened the electronic legal document, and flipped through it carefully with furrowed brows for a long time. Then, she raised her head and looked quietly at Sulu. She shook her head and said, "Even if that lab used to be Professor Shin's and is now yours, you still can't get out after destroying those data." "Why?" Sulu placed his hands, which were bound by the plastic rope, on the table. He looked at her and asked, "Is there a problem with me disciplining my own child?" Hearing this analogy, Su Songzi raised her head and looked quietly at Sulu. She said, "Let's not talk about whether this analogy is appropriate or not. Even if this is your own son, you can educate him, but you can't abuse him and you can't kill him. If you do, then you will violate the Child Protection Act or become a murderer." Without waiting for Sulu to speak, she furrowed her brows and continued to say, "According to the Federation's Confidential Information Protection Act, even if this data is yours, it still has to be monitored by the Federation due to its importance. It cannot be leaked, and it cannot be arbitrarily disposed of. Your right to dispose of this data can, at most, allow you to get a lighter sentence in this case." Sulu lowered his head, took a deep breath, and smiled somewhat helplessly. Su Songzi saw his smile and was slightly stunned. She didn't understand why he could still smile so calmly at a time like this. Did he really think that with the background of the Ministry of Defense, he could go against the laws of the Federation? She slightly furrowed her brows and said, "Not to mention, this is all what you said. I haven't seen the relevant electronic legal documents yet. But since there is new evidence, I will continue to investigate." Su Songzi stood up and began to tidy up the documents on the metal table. She lowered her head and said, "You sign a document later. In the morning, I will go directly to your apartment to get the legal document, and then I will go directly to the Military Inspection Department to apply for evidence preservation." "I don't know if the legal document in the apartment is still there," Sulu suddenly said. Su Songzi's movements slightly paused, and a sense of displeasure rose in her heart. She thought to herself, if it's not there, then where did your previous confidence come from? Sulu lowered his head. He didn't know if the Lee family would enter his apartment to destroy Professor Shin's will. Although logically speaking, those big shots shouldn't use such a boring little trick. For the sake of safety, he would rather pretend that the copy was no longer there. He raised his head and said, "The original legal document is in the hands of a friend of mine. You can go directly to her and ask for it." "Friend? Where does she live?" "Department of National Defense, Shishan Compound Number 3. Her surname is Zhou. Su Songzi heard this address and was slightly stunned. She immediately took a deep breath and immediately understood why her immediate superior would call her in the middle of the night and send her to the prison. It turned out that the backer of this young second lieutenant was her immediate superior's immediate superior. Got it. She looked at Sulu thoughtfully and then prepared to leave. At this moment, there was a sound of footsteps outside the reception room. Inspector Xiao, this way please. An inspector about 30 years old, accompanied by the military prison chief, walked into the reception room. This inspector with the surname Xiao had black hair and looked very capable. When he found that Su Songzi was also in the room, he couldn't help but be slightly surprised. He smiled and asked, Songzi, why are you here? Brother Wenjing? Su Songzi was also a little surprised. She glanced at Su Lu from the corner of her eyes. She didn't know what this young second lieutenant had done to alarm the powerful people of the Capital District Prosecutor's office. This is Second Lieutenant Sug? I was ordered to take him away to assist in the investigation of a case. After exchanging a few pleasantries with Su Songzi, Inspector Xiao went straight to the point. Su Songzi's eyebrows furrowed. She knew the current status of this senior from the law department in the district prosecutor's office. Why had he come here? The strangest thing was that her client, Su Lu, was an active soldier. He should have gone through the federal military's internal legal procedures. Why was the district prosecutor's office interfering? No, this is my client. For some reason, Su Songzi felt a little strange. Without waiting for Su Lu to stand up, she directly rejected this request. Inspector Xiao smiled and took out a document from the briefcase in his hand and put it on the table. Su Songzi picked up the document and looked at it. Her face became serious. She looked at the military prison chief and said, according to the sequence, Su Lu is a military suspect. He must stay in the military prison. Immediately after, she turned to Inspector Xiao and asked in a low voice, what is going on? I am now his legal support lawyer. You should know the sequence of the case very well. He is now involved in the serious crime of destroying the Federation's confidential information. At least wait until the case in my hands is over before you can take over. Su Songzi was very familiar with Xiao Wenjing, so she didn't think too much about what she said. She stared into his eyes and asked in confusion, even if he has other cases, it should be the police headquarters who investigate first. Why did the district prosecutor's office interfere in advance? Inspector Xiao shrugged and glanced at Su Lu, who was silently lowering his head at the table. He moved closer to Su Songzi's ear and said, the sequence of the case and the early interference are actually all for the same reason. This officer committed a serious crime. You should know very well that the sequence of the case is often divided according to the severity of the crime. When the district prosecutor's office encounters this kind of vicious case, they will also interfere in advance. Su Songzi frowned. What kind of serious crime could be more serious than destroying the Federation's confidential data, or a vicious case that required the district prosecutor's office to interfere in advance? Murder. There was a trace of indifference in Inspector Zhao's eyes. He looked at Su Lu at the table in the distance and said, Second Lieutenant Su Lu is suspected of murdering an active duty officer, Park Ji-ho, on the side of the road on Hushan Road last night. According to the Federation's temporary regulations on handling cases involving military personnel, this case is under our jurisdiction. Chapter 193. It was late spring in the suburbs of the capital. Flowers, trees, and leaves shaded the morning sun. It was extremely peaceful. A police car silently moved forward in this beautiful environment. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the scenery of the capital through the observation window. His expression was calm, but no one knew what he was thinking. His hands and feet were still tightly bound. From a suspect of destroying confidential data of the Federation to a suspect of felony murder, the guard duty had been changed from military police to fully armed police, but the security did not decrease in the slightest. He knew very well that regarding the investigation of these two cases, the Federation's relevant government departments were extraordinarily efficient. It was only midnight, but they had actually provided sufficient evidence. And at this time, he was transferred from the military prison to the district prosecutor's office. Naturally, it was the Lee family's operation. With the hidden power of the 7 major Federation families, it was not difficult to influence the speed of the Federation's judicial department. The other side should have known beforehand that he had a strange relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou Xing, but they had been unable to confirm it. When they knew that the female officer of the Ministry of National Defense had entered the prison that night, they immediately threw out the second plan, which was to transfer Su Le to the district prosecutor's office. The Deputy Minister of National Defense might be able to influence everything in the military prison, but his influence on the Federation's judicial department was not that strong, at least compared to the Li family. "Do you have anything to say?" Su Songzi sat beside Su Lu and narrowed her eyes at the person she was dealing with. She was somewhat surprised by the other party's calmness. Logically speaking, she was dealing with the case of Su Lu destroying confidential data of the Federation. As for the case of the murder of active duty military officer Park Ji-ho, under the circumstances that there was no follow-up order from the higher-ups, she could completely ignore it and not follow Su Lu to the district prosecutor's office. But for some reason, Su Songzi felt that this matter was a bit strange. Why would this young second lieutenant, who clearly had Deputy Minister Zhou as his backer, suddenly lose his mind? First, he cold-bloodedly killed people on Hushan Road, then crazily broke into the research institute and smashed it. There was obviously something behind this matter, but unfortunately, Su Lu was not willing to reveal anything to her. "Thank you." After Su Lu said these 2 words, he immediately shut his mouth. He knew very well that what awaited him in the district prosecutor's office would definitely be a torrential storm from the Federation's judicial system. The female officer beside him might be an outstanding judicial talent, but she wouldn't be of any use in this matter. Deputy Minister Zhou had already made his move. Although it was not a strong move, and it was even possible that Zhou Yu had used her father's name to secretly help, it was still a small warning to that side. Su Lu was only thinking about whether the Tai family would make a move after he entered the district procurator general's office. He was waiting. He even vaguely guessed that the reason why the Maestro family was putting so much pressure on him was probably because they were waiting to see the true relationship between him and the Tai family. They wanted to see if the madam would actually care about him. The photo that had been enlarged to 12 inches was gently placed on the table, right in front of Su Li's eyes. The photo was a close-up shot. The throat that had been cut open by a blade looked extremely bloody and terrifying, especially the white trachea that could be faintly seen inside. The blood that had already coagulated flowed down the corpse's cheeks, wetting a large patch of blonde hair. When mixed together, it was as black as ink. Su Lu quietly looked at the large photo in front of him. His expression did not change at all, but the corners of his eyes twitched. Inspector Xiao Wenjing had been silently observing his expression from the side. He walked up coldly and placed 7 or 8 photos in front of Su Lu. He did not ask a single question. He only used the photos that had been enlarged to the extreme to show the horrible state of the corpse and the wounds, as well as the silence in the interrogation room, to pressure Su Lu. "Do you know the victim?" "Yes, Park Ji-ho. We participated in the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment exam together." If it was said that when Su Lu killed Park Ji-ho last night, there was still a trace of sadness and frustration in his heart. But now, when he looked at these enlarged photos, he was able to maintain absolute calmness. Other than the slight twitch in the corner of his eyes at the beginning, his expression was as calm as usual. But it was this calmness that exposed the problem. Xiao Wenjing coldly looked at his face. He knew that his judgment was not wrong. This young second lieutenant in front of him was definitely the murderer. It was just that he could not determine his motive at the moment. "Last night at 9:40, where were you?" An assistant inspector from the district prosecutor's office asked in a mechanical voice. With a click, Xiao Wenjing lit a cigarette. "I can't remember the exact time, but I should have been on the way back to the apartment. You didn't work at the research institute yesterday afternoon. Why did you come back so late?" "My girlfriend is pregnant. We had a pregnancy checkup last night." "Girlfriend?" Name? Zhou Yu. Su Songzi, who had been listening in the interrogation room, maintained her silence. At this time, when she heard the name of Su Li's girlfriend, she could not help but frown. Only now did she know that this young second lieutenant was actually the future son-in-law of Deputy Minister Zhou. She could not help but think of the recent news that the minister's daughter was pregnant before marriage. Did you pass by Hushan Road? I forgot. There was a fight at the entrance of Hushan Road, and we've already invited the people involved. They've already confirmed that you participated in that fight and injured 8 people. How could you forget such a big thing? It doesn't matter if you forgot. The testimony of the witnesses and the surveillance video at the entrance will definitely help you remember. Sulu slowly raised his head. The tiredness of the night made him slightly anxious at this time. In an extremely unusual way, he retorted with a harsh sentence. I never remember the time when I was chased by a dog. The 2nd District Prosecutor's Office in the capital was extremely efficient. They had completely grasped Su Li's whereabouts in the first half of the night yesterday. They had also obtained the testimony of the young masters of the Federation. The most important thing was that these people testified that after Su Lu killed 8 of their people, he took a knife and directly rushed to the mountain at Hushan Road. 4 hours later, the body of the active military officer, Park Ji-ho, was found on the cliff. The conclusion from the forensics department is out. According to the testimony of the witnesses, the knife model was just right to cause the fatal wound on the neck of the deceased. Sulu lowered his head. He did not expect that the young masters and bodyguards that he had beaten up would provide such crucial testimony. After all, he was not a professional killer, nor was he a professional criminal. At that time, he really did not care about these things. However, the knife had long been thrown into the stream in the ivy garden. Presumably, the 7th young master of the Li family did not have the intention to betray him. It should be noted that Park Ji-ho's body was found a few hours later. A lot of the real-time evidence was eliminated, all thanks to the delay of the 7th young master of the Li family. You took a knife, rushed to the cliff, and cold-bloodedly and cruelly killed a young and outstanding Federation officer. The assistant prosecutor saw that Su Lu had sunk into silence, so he continued unhurriedly, the chain of evidence is already very complete. I advise you to plead guilty in time. We will plead for you to the judge. Su Lu was still silent. However, when he heard the words plead guilty, he subconsciously glanced at the female officer, Su Songzi, who was sitting quietly not far away, and smiled. Prosecutor Xiao shook his head slightly. He knew that before there was actual evidence, this cold-blooded second lieutenant would not speak. He signaled to the assistant prosecutor, patted Su Li's shoulder, and led him out of the interrogation room. Su Songzi also stood up. It was unknown whether it was a coincidence or a deliberate arrangement by the district prosecutor's office, but the two groups of people who should not have met each other ran into each other. Su Lu, whose hands and feet were tied, narrowed his eyes as he looked at the mother and daughter hugging each other and crying by the corridor. There was also a middle-aged man who was desperately smoking by the side. His movements subconsciously slowed down. The crying mother had blonde hair, and the middle-aged man looked a lot like Park Ji-ho. From his clothes, he should be from an extraordinary family. You are the killer? The middle-aged man's eyes were bloodshot. He could not understand how his only son had died just like that. He glared at Su Lu fiercely, as if he wanted to swallow him whole. The mother and daughter hugging each other and crying were Park Ji-ho's mother and younger sister. The mother, who had just experienced the pain of losing her son, lunged at Su Lu like an injured female beast. Her fingers desperately dug at his face, accompanied by heart-wrenching cries. The sharp fingernails were only an inch away from Su Li's eyes. The district prosecutor's office desperately tried to stop the angry family members of the victims, and it took a lot of effort to calm the chaos in the corridor. Park Ji-ho's younger sister was about 13 or 14 years old. She stared at Su Li's face with an extremely cold and angry gaze, and spat on his face. You'd better stay in prison forever. Park Ji-ho's father hugged his wife, looked at Su Lu who was lowering his head and wiping his saliva, and said in a trembling voice, or I will definitely kill you. kill you, making such a personal threat in front of the prosecutors, but the prosecutors did not have the slightest intention of stopping them. They just coldly pushed Sulu away. Outside the iron gate of the temporary detention center, Prosecutor Xiao Wenjing looked at Sulu and said, "If I were you, I would plead guilty earlier. Otherwise, there will be a lot of hard days ahead. You don't have direct evidence, you don't have witnesses, you don't have a knife, you don't have anything." Su Songzi followed behind Prosecutor Xiao and said quickly, "Use your own professional qualities to judge whether he is the murderer or not." Prosecutor Xiao suddenly turned around, stared at Su Songzi, and said quickly and angrily in a low voice, "If he is not the murderer, I will cut off my head and give it to you." What is the motive? And the most important thing is that we are professionals. We have to believe, and can only believe, the evidence. Xiao Wenjing threw the finished cigarette at his feet. He had not slept in the middle of the night, and his eyes were a little sunken. He said with a hint of sarcasm, "I will find the evidence, but I didn't expect that the researchers of the Husk Institute would be so cold-blooded." Su Songzi was silent. She knew that the enlarged bloody photos and the encounter with the family members of the victims in the corridor were all psychological attacks that Prosecutor Xiao was good at. But looking at Su Li's calm expression, it seemed that he was not affected at all. It might be reasonable to say that the young second lieutenant was cold-blooded. The girlfriend he mentioned earlier is the daughter of our deputy minister Zhou. I know, but I don't care about that. Prosecutor Xiao stamped out the cigarette by his feet. Su Songzi looked at his expression and suddenly had an ominous thought. She looked at him and said, "What are you going to do?" "As a judicial officer, I will not do things like extorting confessions by torture. Don't worry." Xiao Wenjing turned around and walked towards the interrogation room. He said gloomily, "But he should feel what he should feel." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.